Clara Whitmore pressed her father's letter so hard against her chest that the paper crinkled and bent, and still, she could not make herself move toward that front door. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear of the road ahead. From the look on her father's face when he handed her the envelope, the way his eyes slid sideways away from hers, the way he cleared his throat and stared at the floorboards like they owed him something. He couldn't face Nathaniel Carter himself. So he handed the job to her. The daughter he'd spent 25 years treating like furniture, useful when needed, invisible the rest of the time. She was being sent to beg, and everyone in that house knew it. Before we go any further into Clara's story, if this kind of tale moves something in your heart, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's follow Clara all the way to the end, because what happens next is something none of them saw coming. Thomas Whitmore had not always been a desperate man. There was a time not so long ago when he ran the most reliable freight operation between Billings and the Northern Territories. 3 wagons, 6 horses, 2 hired men, and a reputation that took him 15 years to build. Clara remembered those years. She remembered her father standing tall at the dinner table carving the Sunday roast with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world was manageable, who believed that hard work and good sense would always be enough. Then came the winter of 1882. A business arrangement with a partner named Gideon Price had seemed at the time like the kind of opportunity a man would be a fool to refuse. Price was smooth-talking and well-dressed and knew how to make a crooked deal sound like a blessing from heaven. He convinced Thomas to sink every spare dollar he had into a joint freight contract with the Northern Pacific Railroad, a contract that Price had assured him was all but signed. Guaranteed income, expansion, security. The contract was never real. Price disappeared sometime in March of that year, taking Thomas's investment money and leaving behind nothing but a forged signature on a worthless piece of paper. The hired men had to be let go. 2 of the wagons were sold to cover immediate debts. And Thomas Whitmore, who had once stood tall at that dinner table, began the slow and terrible process of shrinking. He borrowed money from neighbors. He borrowed from the church deacon. He sold his wife's good china and told himself it was temporary. And then, because he had run out of neighbors willing to lend and institutions willing to trust him, he went to the one man in the valley who still had deep enough pockets to help Nathaniel Carter, owner of the Carter Land and Cattle Company, the largest private ranch operation in the entire Montana Territory. Nathaniel Carter had lent Thomas Whitmore $4,000 over the course of 8 months. He had not charged interest beyond what was fair. He had not sent men to the door with threats. He had simply waited with the patience of a man who had more than enough and could therefore afford to be still. But now 2 years had passed since the last payment. The debt had grown with time and silence, and Thomas Whitmore had finally reached the point where he could not sleep through the night without waking in a cold sweat, convinced that Nathaniel Carter's men were outside the window. The letter Clara carried was supposed to be an apology, a request for more time, a promise to repay somehow someday what was owed. But Thomas Whitmore had not been able to bring himself to deliver it in person. Carter's a reasonable man. Her father had told her that morning, his voice carrying the particular weakness of someone trying to sound certain when they were not certain at all. He won't be hard on a woman. He'll listen to you better than he'd listen to me right now. Clara had looked at her father for a long moment. She had looked at the way he held his coffee cup with both hands, even though the morning was not cold. She had looked at the slight tremor in his jaw, the way he kept glancing toward the window, like he was checking for something he hoped wouldn't be there. "Papa," she'd said quietly, "you're asking me to carry what belongs to you." "I'm asking you to help your family," he'd said, and that was the end of the conversation. She was the oldest of 3 children. Her younger brother Marcus was 18 and full of the kind of righteous anger that only boys with no real responsibilities ever managed to sustain. Her younger sister Josephine was 16 and pretty in the way that made people in town smile at her, automatically the way they never smiled at Clara. If their father had asked Josephine to ride to the Carter Ranch, the whole town would have had opinions about it: worry, concern, protective instinct. Someone would have offered to accompany her. Nobody offered to accompany Clara, Nobody thought to. Clara Whitmore was 25 years old, and she had lived her entire life inside the particular silence that settles around women. The world has decided are not worth looking at twice. She was not small. She had never been small. Even as a child, she had been solid and broad-shouldered, and the children in school had made sure she understood that this was a problem. They had made sure she understood it with words mostly, and sometimes with the specific cruelty of exclusion. The birthday parties. She wasn't invited to the dances where no boy ever crossed the room in her direction, the way adults would look at her mother with a particular kind of sympathetic expression that Clara, even at 7 years old, had understood, meant what a shame. She had grown up knowing with the kind of deep bone-level certainty that leaves no room for argument that the world saw her body before it saw anything else. That whatever she was on the inside, and she knew privately with quiet dignity, that she was more than what they saw. It would never matter as much as what she looked like on the outside. And so when her father needed someone to go beg mercy from a powerful and intimidating man, he had chosen her. Because Clara had nothing left to lose. At least that was what he believed. She mounted the old mare, tucked the letter into the front pocket of her dress, where she could feel it against her ribs, and rode west toward the Carter Ranch without saying goodbye to anyone. The summer of 1884 in the Montana Territory was the kind of summer that turned the grass to the color of wheat and baked the wagon wheel ruts in the road until they were hard as iron. The air smelled of dry earth and distant pine. Clara rode for nearly 2 hours along a road that narrowed as it climbed, passing through stretches of open grassland that gave way eventually to the well-maintained fencing of the Carter operation. Clean white posts, wire-strung tight cattle visible in the distance in clusters of rust and brown and black. She had never been to the Carter Ranch before. Nobody she knew visited Nathaniel Carter socially. He was the kind of man people talked about respectfully, carefully, the way they talked about weather patterns and property lines, but not the kind of man anyone felt easy around. He had come to Montana from somewhere back east, made his money in cattle and land purchases before most of the territory had been properly mapped, and he ran his operation with a methodical efficiency that had earned him both admiration and a certain wariness. He was known to be fair. He was also known to be cold. He had been married once. His wife Eleanor had died 4 years ago in childbirth along with the baby. People in town said that after Eleanor's death, Nathaniel Carter had closed something in himself, pulled the shutters down, so to speak, and had not opened them since. He threw himself into the ranch. He built the herd larger. He bought more land. He worked from before dawn until after dark, and he did not laugh easily, and he did not invite company. His only apparent softness was the little girl who lived with him at the ranch. Lillian, his niece, 8 years old, who had come to live at the Carter property 2 years ago after Nathaniel's younger sister and her husband died of fever. The town knew about Lillian because they saw her sometimes in the dry goods store with the housekeeper, a stout older woman named Mrs. Beaumont. The little girl was said to be quiet and serious like her uncle. Said to have his same dark eyes and the same way of watching the world with more patience than any child should need to have. Clara thought about that little girl as she rode. She thought about what it must be like to be 8 years old and placed in a house with a man who had closed his shutters. Then she stopped thinking about it because the Carter Ranch house was visible ahead of her. Now a large, well-built structure set back from the road behind a wooden gate with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and men moving in the yard beyond, going about the business of a working cattle operation. Horses at the fence rail. Chickens crossing the yard with their ridiculous dignity. Somewhere in the distance, someone was hammering. Clara pulled her mare to a stop at the gate. A young ranch hand was nearby, and he noticed her and walked over with the unhurried gait of someone who was not in the habit of being surprised by much. "Help you, ma'am," he said. "I'm here to see Mr. Carter," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She had made a decision somewhere on the road over that her voice was going to be steady, no matter what happened today. "My name is Clara Whitmore. My father, Thomas Whitmore, has an account with Mr. Carter. I have a letter from my father." The young man's face did not change in any particular way. He nodded once and told her to wait, then went back toward the main house at the same unhurried pace. Clara sat on her mare and did not allow herself to look around with obvious interest, though she noticed everything. The quality of the fencing, the condition of the horses, the way the ranch hands moved with the practiced economy of men who knew their work and did not waste motion. This was a well-run operation. This was a place where things were done properly. She had about 3 minutes of waiting before the front door of the house opened. The man who came down the porch steps was not what Clara had been expecting, though she would have had difficulty explaining what she had been expecting. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something angular and serious. He walked the way men walked when they were accustomed to covering ground efficiently. He was wearing plain working clothes, no indication that he'd been interrupted from anything that required dressing up, and he wore them the way powerful men often wore plain things, with a kind of unconscious authority that made the plainness itself look significant. He came to the gate and looked at her. Not up at her in the way some men looked at a woman on horseback with a vague kind of dismissiveness, treating her like a problem that had appeared without warning. He looked at her directly with a steadiness that Clara was not prepared for. Not rude, not pitying, simply present. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. "I'm Nathaniel Carter. Would you like to come inside?" It was not what she'd expected him to say. "Thank you," she said, and dismounted. Mrs. Beaumont appeared at the door as if summoned by some silent signal and took charge of the mare without being asked, calling to one of the hands to see the horse watered and rested. Clara followed Nathaniel Carter up the porch steps and into the front room of the house, which was large and clean and filled with the kind of functional, well-made furniture that said money without saying it loudly. There was a child at the table near the window. She was small with dark braids and the aforementioned serious eyes, and she was reading a book that was probably too advanced for her age, though she was reading it with the focused intensity of a person for whom the book was the most interesting thing in the room. She looked up when they entered. "Lillian," Nathaniel said, "go on and ask Mrs. Beaumont about your arithmetic lesson." Lillian regarded Clara for a moment, with the unashamed directness that only small children manage without being rude. Then she said, "Yes, Uncle Nathaniel," closed her book and left the room. Clara watched her go. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said. He did not sit himself, not immediately. He was looking at her with that steady, unreadable attention. "Can I offer you something, water or coffee?" "Water, thank you," Clara said. She sat in the chair nearest the window because it was the one furthest from feeling cornered. "I appreciate you seeing me, Mr. Carter. I know you weren't expecting." "I wasn't expecting anyone," he agreed, moving to pour water from a pitcher on the sideboard. He brought it to her and then took the chair across from her rather than the one behind the large desk at the far end of the room. That surprised her. He could have sat behind the desk. That would have been the obvious choice. The choice that placed him in the position of authority, the creditor at his table, the debtor in his chair. He chose not to. "But you're here now, so let's talk." Clara set her water down on the table beside her and took out the letter. "My father asked me to bring you this," she said. He wanted you to understand the situation and to ask for more time. He intended to come himself, but She stopped. She had been going to say he wasn't well, which was the kind of polite untruth that smoothed things over without helping anyone. But something about the way Nathaniel Carter was looking at her with that quiet, patient directness that asked for nothing except honesty made the polite untruth feel wrong. It felt like wearing wet clothes, uncomfortable in a way that was impossible to ignore. "He couldn't face you," Clara said instead. "He was too ashamed." Nathaniel looked at her. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "So he sent you," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement, and it was said in a tone that Clara could not quite read. Not angry, not contemptuous, simply observational with a weight behind it that she didn't understand yet. "Yes," she said. "How long did it take you to ride here?" "Just under 2 hours." "In this heat?" "Yes." He looked down at the letter in her hands for a moment, then back up at her face. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "how old are you?" The question caught her off guard. 25, she said. "And you live at home with your father?" "Yes, I help manage the household." She kept her voice even. My mother passed 3 years ago. There's my brother Marcus and my sister Josephine. I—" She paused. "I take care of things. I see." He said it slowly, like he was setting the words somewhere careful. "What do you do when you're not taking care of things?" Clara blinked. In her experience, powerful men in positions of financial authority over her family did not ask her what she did. They looked past her, around her, through her, toward whatever matter they actually cared about. This question, this straightforward, genuine question about her, had the disorienting quality of a door opening in a wall she'd believed had no doors. "I bake," she said, because it was true. "I keep a kitchen garden. I read when there's time, though there isn't always time. I—" She stopped herself, because something about his patient listening was making her talk more than she meant to, and she needed to remember why she was here. She held out the letter. "Mr. Carter." The letter. I took it. He read it in the unhurried way he seemed to do most things, and Clara watched his face for the signs she'd expected: irritation, contempt, the banker's expression that said, "This is not good enough." She did not see those signs. His face remained still and attentive, the face of a man who was absorbing information rather than reacting to it. When he finished reading, he set the letter down on his knee and looked at her. "Did you know what was in this?" he asked. "Not the exact words," she said, "but I know the situation. Your father owes me $4,200. Yes. And his plan, as communicated in this letter, is to send me his apologies and ask for another 12 months. Yes. And if 12 months isn't sufficient," Clara did not look away, "then he will ask for another 12 months, Mr. Carter. I won't pretend otherwise." Her voice did not waver. "My father is a good man who made a bad decision and has been outrun by the consequences ever since. He doesn't have $4,000. He doesn't know when he will. I can tell you that he works hard and that he intends to repay every cent, but I can't tell you when because I don't know, and it wouldn't be honest for me to claim otherwise." A silence settled between them. Outside, someone called across the yard to someone else. A horse shifted and blew. The summer afternoon pressed against the windows. Nathaniel Carter said, "Did you come all this way to apologize for a debt you never made?" Clara felt something move through her chest, a sensation she did not have a name for right away. It took her a moment to recognize it as the feeling of being accurately seen, not looked at, seen. "No," she said after a moment. "I came because my father needed someone to come, and I was the one available." She paused. "But I won't apologize for him. I can explain his situation. I can ask for your patience. I can't apologize for choices I didn't make." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is the first thing anyone from your family has said to me in 2 years that I believe completely." Clara looked at him. "Mr. Carter," she said slowly, "what do you mean?" He stood and walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the yard where his men moved about their work. He had his hands clasped behind his back, in the way of a man thinking through something he has already thought through before arriving at a conclusion he has been approaching for some time. "Your father has sent me 3 letters in 2 years, he said. Each one apologized profusely and promised repayment in terms that were upon examination impossible to fulfill. Each one told me what a good man he was, and how his situation was temporary, and how he had a plan." He turned from the window. None of those letters were written by a man who believed what he was writing. Clara said nothing. "Because he was right. This visit," Nathaniel continued, "was not your father's idea of a solution. It was his idea of a delay. He sent you here believing that I would be less inclined to take legal action against a woman than against a man." He said it plainly, without cruelty, as though he were describing the weather. "Which is possibly true. But it's not a solution, Miss Whitmore, and I think you know that." "Yes," Clara said, "I know that. Then what would you like to talk about?" "Because if you want to talk about the debt, the real debt, the practical problem of $4,000 and no clear path to repayment, I'm willing to have that conversation. But I'm not interested in another letter. And I'm not interested in apologies for mistakes that aren't yours." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me what you need from my family, Mr. Carter. Not what my father promised. What you actually need. He looked at her with something that might on a different man have been called surprise. On Nathaniel Carter. It was a slight widening of attention, a sharpening of focus, like a man who has been watching a horizon and has suddenly noticed something worth watching. What I need, he said slowly, and what is owed are not always the same thing. I know, but start with what you need. He came back to his chair and sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment and then back at her, and when he spoke again, his voice was slightly different, slightly less the voice of a creditor and slightly more the voice of a man. I need someone to manage this household, he said. Mrs. Beaumont is getting on in years. She can't keep up with the kitchen and the house and Lillian's lessons and the bookkeeping and everything else that needs doing. I've had 3 women come out from town in the past year to interview for a housekeeper position. Not one of them lasted more than 2 weeks. He stopped. This house is difficult, he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, a plainness and absence of excuse that told Clara he knew exactly why they'd left. Because of you, she asked. He looked at her again with that sharp attention. Most likely, he said. Mr. Carter, Clara said. I already manage a household. I manage one on a budget that would make yours look like a fortune, and I do it with fewer resources and more difficult personalities than you seem to have here. She folded her hands in her lap. If it would reduce my father's debt for me to take that position, a genuine position properly arranged for an agreed period of time, I would consider it. The silence that followed was a thinking silence, not a dismissive one. You'd stay here, he said, at the ranch, if that's what the arrangement required. She kept her voice practical. I'm not suggesting anything improper, Mr. Carter. I'm suggesting a labor arrangement. I work, you reduce the debt. It's honest trade. Your father would agree to this. My father, Clara said with a quietness that held more weight than volume, sent me here today because he believed I was the least valuable thing he could afford to risk. If I come back with an arrangement that protects his debt, he will agree to anything. Nathaniel Carter looked at her for a long time without speaking. Outside, the afternoon was shifting, the heat beginning to ease by degrees. Somewhere in the house, she could hear Lillian's voice and Mrs. Beaumont's voice in the back of the property, engaged in the ongoing negotiation of lessons. You're more honest than most people I meet, Nathaniel said finally. I've found that honesty is easier when you have nothing to protect, Clara said. I don't have a reputation to maintain in this town. I don't have money to lose. I don't have any particular standing to protect. She picked up her water glass and set it back down without drinking from it. All I have is what I actually am, so I might as well use it. And what do you think you actually are? He asked. It was not mocking. It was the kind of question a person asked when they genuinely wanted to know the answer. Clara thought about it for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking, which was a habit she'd developed over years of being in rooms where no one expected her to have thoughts worth having. I'm dependable, she said. I'm not easily frightened. I work hard and I don't need to be thanked for it. I notice things that need doing, and I do them without being asked. She paused. I'm also not interesting at parties, I'm told. But I don't suppose that's relevant here. Something happened on Nathaniel Carter's face then. It happened quickly, and it was not a full smile. It was more like the shadow of what a smile might look like on a man who had forgotten how to make one easily. But it was there. No, he said. I don't suppose it is. He stood again, and this time there was a decision in the way he moved, the specific quality of motion that belongs to someone who has just settled something internally and is now acting on it. Miss Whitmore, he said, I'm going to ask you something, and I'm going to ask you to answer it as honestly as you've answered everything else. All right, she said. If I told you right now that I intended to pursue your father's debt through legal channels, that I was within my rights to do so, which I am, what would your family lose? Clara did not flinch from the question. She had thought about it in the long 2 hours of riding in the particular way the brain works when it's going towards something frightening and can't stop. The last wagon, she said. The house. My father's remaining equipment. She kept her voice steady. Marcus would have to find work immediately. Josephine might have to leave school. She paused. My father would probably not recover from it. Not in any way that matters. And you? I would manage, she said. I've managed before. He looked at her for a moment. I believe you, he said. And then, here is what I propose, Miss Whitmore. Come to dinner tonight. Stay the night. Mrs. Beaumont will prepare the guest room, everything proper. Tomorrow, look at the house. Look at what needs doing. Look at Lillian's situation. And then tell me honestly whether you think you can manage this household, or whether you'd be better served returning to town with your father's letter unanswered. Clara was quiet for a moment. You're not extending a legal threat, she said slowly. I am not. You're genuinely offering a trial arrangement. I am. Why? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because my house needs someone who will tell me the truth about it. And in the last hour, you've told me more truth than I've heard in 2 years. Clara looked at him. Really looked at him in the direct and steady way she had learned to look at things when she needed to understand them. The way she'd learned to look at the horizon on an uncertain morning. Not with hope exactly, but with the particular clear-eyed attention of someone who was willing to see whatever was actually there. Then she said, I'll stay. Dinner that night was quieter than Clara expected, and more complicated than it appeared. Mrs. Beaumont, who had a face like a wise and weathered apple, and sharp eyes that missed nothing, served a meal of beef stew and fresh bread that was better than anything Clara had eaten in months, and watched Clara with the attentive neutrality of someone reserving judgment. Lillian sat across from Clara at the long table, and ate with the careful manners of a child who has been taught to be good in company, but kept directing sideways looks at Clara with those serious dark eyes. You're not from here, Lillian said during a pause between the bread and the stew. I'm from town, Clara said. Whitmore family. We don't go to town much, Lillian said. Lillian, Nathaniel said. It's all right, Clara said. Do you like it here at the ranch? Lillian considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. It's quiet, she said finally. I like the horses. I don't like the quiet. Lillian, Nathaniel said again, and this time the word carried a quality that was less reprimand and more something else, something that had a cost to it. Clara looked at him. He was looking at his niece with an expression that was entirely unguarded for exactly 1 second before he noticed Clara watching, and replaced it with his usual attentive stillness. But in that 1 second, Clara saw it clearly, the look of a man who knows he is failing at something important and doesn't know how to stop. After dinner, Nathaniel excused himself to the study. Mrs. Beaumont showed Clara to the guest room clean, simply furnished with a window that looked out over the dark shapes of the cattle pastures, and handed her a fresh towel and a candle. You're not what I expected, Mrs. Beaumont said at the door before leaving. What did you expect? Clara asked. Don't know exactly. The older woman's eyes were candid in the way older women's eyes sometimes were when they decided there was no point in pretending. He's not easy to work for. I say that having worked for him 4 years, he's not unkind, but he's closed in on himself, since Eleanor passed. She paused. The girls who came before you for the housekeeper position, they left because they couldn't stand the quiet. Because he doesn't talk much and he doesn't notice them, and they wanted to be noticed. I'm not here to be noticed, Clara said. Mrs. Beaumont looked at her for another moment. No, she said. I don't suppose you are. And she left. Clara set the candle on the windowsill and looked out at the dark pastures for a long time. The cattle were distant shapes in the moonlight. The sky above Montana was enormous, more stars than Clara could remember seeing, pressed close and brilliant in the dark. She thought about her father back in town, waiting for her return. She thought about the letter she'd carried against her ribs for 2 hours. She thought about Nathaniel Carter's face in the moment before he caught himself, the look of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't name. She thought about Lillian saying, I don't like the quiet. Clara had spent her whole life being quiet. Being made quiet. Being the person in the room that nobody needed to listen to. Nobody felt compelled to notice. She had adapted to that silence the way some creatures adapted to dark water, not because they preferred the dark, but because the dark was where they lived, and you survived the place where you lived, or you didn't survive at all. But Lillian didn't know how to adapt yet. Lillian was 8 years old, with her mother's grave still fresh, somewhere in her understanding of the world, placed in a house with a man who loved her, but had forgotten how to say it out loud. Clara blew out the candle. In the dark room, in the big Montana night, she made a private decision that had nothing to do with debt arrangements or household management or any of the practical language she and Nathaniel Carter had used with each other all afternoon. She decided to stay. Not for the arrangement, not for her father's sake. She decided to stay because somewhere in this silent, shuttered-up house, there was a little girl who didn't like the quiet and a man who didn't know what to do about it. And Clara Whitmore had spent 25 years learning exactly how to do the things that nobody else knew how to do. She lay down on the clean, simple bed and looked at the ceiling. The stars outside the window were enormous. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow would tell her whether she had made a decision or a mistake. But tomorrow, she thought, was what tomorrow was for. Clara woke before the sun did. That was nothing unusual for her. She had spent years waking in the gray hour before dawn, when the house was still, and she could think without anyone needing something from her. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar room, listening to the sounds of a working ranch coming to life outside the distant low of cattle, the clank of a bucket, the voices of men moving toward the barn, with the quiet purpose of people who had done this same thing every morning for years and would do it every morning for years more. She got up, dressed quickly, and found the kitchen before Mrs. Beaumont did. The older woman appeared 20 minutes later to find Clara already at the stove with a fire going and biscuit dough mixed and cut and a pot of coffee, sending its steam up toward the rafters. Mrs. Beaumont stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds without saying anything. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Clara said. "How many men eat breakfast here before they go out?" 12 most mornings. 14 during the busy season. "Then we'd better make more biscuits." Mrs. Beaumont came the rest of the way into the kitchen. She didn't say anything else about it, but she tied on her apron and reached for the mixing bowl, and the two of them worked side by side in the early quiet with the ease of women who understood that kitchens were the truest kind of common ground. Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway at 10 minutes past 6. He was already dressed for the day's work, and he stopped when he saw Clara at the stove with the brief contained surprise of a man who has walked into a room and found it rearranged in a way that is better than it was, but unexpected enough to require adjustment. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Carter." She did not look up from the pan. "Coffee's on the sideboard. Biscuits in about 10 minutes. A pause. "You didn't need to." "I was awake," she said simply. "And the kitchen needed doing." She heard him cross the room, heard the sound of him pouring coffee, heard the brief silence of a man drinking his first cup of the morning and finding it better than expected. Then he said, "How do you take yours?" "Just as it comes," she said. "Thank you." He poured a second cup and set it on the counter beside her without comment. She picked it up without comment. And that small, unremarkable exchange. Two people, a kitchen. A cup of coffee was the first time in a very long time that Clara Whitmore had stood beside another person and felt something that was neither invisible nor observed, but simply present. She filed it away. She didn't examine it. There was too much work to do. Breakfast was served on the long table in the back of the house where the ranch hands came in shifts to eat, knocking mud from their boots at the door, with the automatic courtesy of men who'd been told to do it enough times. Clara served alongside Mrs. Beaumont, and she felt the looks, the quick sliding assessments that men gave when something unexpected appeared in their routine. She was used to those looks. She had been receiving some version of them her entire life. She served the biscuits and the eggs and the bacon with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything, and she did not acknowledge the looks and did not shrink from them. And after about 10 minutes, the hands went back to eating and talking among themselves, which was exactly what she'd been waiting for. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table. He ate with the same quiet focus he seemed to bring to most things, and Clara noticed that he listened more than he spoke, that he gathered information from the conversation around him, the way a good farmer gathered water. Nothing wasted. He noticed her noticing him, and he did not look away from it, which was unusual enough that Clara had to make a deliberate choice to carry the coffee pot to the other end of the table and stop watching his face. After breakfast, she went looking for Lillian. She found the girl in the small room at the back of the house that was meant to be a schoolroom. There was a desk and a blackboard and a shelf of books, and Lillian was sitting at the desk with her chin in her hands, staring at an arithmetic problem on the board with the specific expression of a person who has surrendered. "What's the problem?" Clara asked from the doorway. Lillian looked up. "Long division," she said with the gravity of someone reporting a natural disaster. "May I?" Clara came in and looked at the blackboard. "Who taught you the first steps?" "Mrs. Beaumont. But she says she can't do figures past simple sums. And Uncle Nathaniel doesn't have time." Clara pulled the other chair up beside the desk and sat down. She was aware dimly that she hadn't been asked to tutor Lillian, that this was not part of any arrangement she'd discussed with Nathaniel Carter, that she was adding without permission to the scope of her presence in this house. She also noticed that Lillian had pulled her chair half an inch closer the moment Clara sat down, the way children move toward warmth without knowing they were doing it. "All right," Clara said. "Let's start from where you're stuck." She spent the better part of an hour at that desk talking Lillian through division problems with a patience that came naturally, because the child was genuinely trying, not performing effort for approval, but actually working. Biting her lip when she got stuck, making a small sharp sound of satisfaction when something clicked into place. Lillian was smart. She was also lonely in the particular quiet way of a child who had learned not to make too much noise about it. "Do you miss your parents?" Clara asked between problems. She didn't plan to ask it, but the question was there, and she had the sense that Lillian had been waiting without knowing it for someone to ask. Lillian was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "But I don't talk about it." "Why not?" "Because Uncle Nathaniel gets that look." "What look?" "The one where he doesn't know what to do." Lillian said it matter-of-factly without blame. "He wants to help, but he doesn't know how, so I try not to make him feel bad." Clara looked at this child, this 8-year-old girl who had taken on the responsibility of managing her guardian's grief so that he wouldn't have to feel worse about his inadequacy, and felt something tighten in her chest. Not pity. Pity was the wrong thing to feel for Lillian, who was doing something remarkable, even if it was also something a child shouldn't have to do. "You're very kind," Clara said. "But you know you're allowed to need things." Lillian considered this. "Are you?" she asked. The question arrived with the particular directness of children who asked the things adults had agreed not to ask each other. Clara sat with it for a moment. "I'm learning," she said. By midday, Clara had walked the full length of the house top to bottom and made a list in her head, not on paper, because she didn't want to seem presumptuous with a list of what needed doing. The kitchen was Mrs. Beaumont's domain and was efficiently managed, though the pantry stocks needed organizing, and the pickling supplies were low for this stage of summer. The front room was clean, but bare of any warmth, functional, impersonal. The room of a man who had stopped thinking about rooms as places people actually lived. The study was orderly, with the meticulous precision of someone who used order as a container for feelings they weren't addressing. The upstairs linen was adequate. The laundry system was workable, but slower than it needed to be. The back porch had a broken step that was a genuine danger, particularly for Lillian. She was coming back down the main staircase when she nearly walked into Nathaniel Carter, who was coming up. They both stopped. "I was looking for you," he said. "I was looking at the house," she said. And she told him about the pantry, the broken step on the back porch, the laundry system, the front room. She told him directly without softening it or making it diplomatic, because he'd said he wanted truth, and she intended to provide it consistently. He listened without interrupting, and his expression was the listening expression she was beginning to recognize, still on the surface, absorbing underneath. When she finished, he said, "The step's been broken 3 months. I told myself I'd get to it." "It's a fall risk for Lillian," Clara said. "I know." He said it with a flatness that was not indifference. It was the flatness of a man who knew his failings precisely and carried them like stones in his pockets. "You're right. I'll have someone see to it this afternoon. I can manage the pantry and the laundry reorganization myself," Clara said. "Those are straightforward. The front room." She paused. "That one's yours to decide." He looked at her. "What would you do with it?" "I'd make it look like someone lived there," she said. "Not like a room in a hotel." Something passed across his face. Not offense. Something older than offense. Eleanor used to keep flowers on the table by the window, he said. It came out quietly like information he hadn't intended to offer, and then couldn't retrieve once it was in the air between them. I had the housekeeper remove them, after. Clara did not say she was sorry. He wasn't asking for condolence. She said, "Flowers are your call, Mr. Carter. I'm not trying to replace anything." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly required by the conversation. Then he said, "I know you're not," and went on up the stairs. Clara went to the kitchen, found a basket, and went out to the kitchen garden to take stock of what Mrs. Beaumont had growing. She stayed out there for a while longer than the task required because the sun was not yet at its worst, and the garden was doing better than she'd expected. Herbs and kitchen vegetables, and along the back fence, a straggly rose bush that looked like it hadn't been tended in years, but was still fighting, still producing a few determined blooms in spite of everything. She looked at the roses for a moment. Then she went back inside and didn't say anything about them. That afternoon, two things happened. The first was that Dale Creston came to the ranch. Dale Creston was one of the two men in the area who'd lent money to Thomas Whitmore when Thomas was running out of people to borrow from, and he had come apparently to speak to Nathaniel Carter about the debt situation. Clara was in the front room reorganizing the bookshelf when she heard the voice at the door, and something in the carrying quality of it, loud in the way of men who believed their volume was an argument, made her go still. "Heard you had company, Carter," Dale Creston said in the front hall. He hadn't bothered to lower his voice. "Heard old Thomas Whitmore sent his girl out here to beg you off." "Mr. Creston," Nathaniel said. His voice was level. "Come into the study. No need to be private about it. Whole town knows the situation. Whitmore owes money all across the valley. You ain't the only one he's made promises to." A pause. "So what did she offer you, the girl? What's old Thomas's plan this time?" Clara set the book in her hand down on the shelf very carefully. "That's not your concern," Nathaniel said, still level. But something had altered in his voice, an edge under the level like iron under still water. "Maybe not. But I'm curious what a man like you does with a woman like that, showing up on his doorstep asking favors." A sound not quite a laugh. Something that assumed permission it hadn't been given. "Don't reckon she's got much to offer, does she?" The silence that followed was the kind that had a shape to it. Clara was standing in the front room, one hand on the bookshelf, perfectly still. She was aware of her own breathing. She was aware of a sensation she recognized, the specific practiced flatness she had learned to apply to her face and her body and her voice whenever someone said something like that in range of her hearing. The practiced invisibility. The learned stillness of a woman who had gotten very good at pretending she hadn't heard. And then she heard Nathaniel Carter say, in a voice that was no longer level at all, "Get out of my house." Clara's hand tightened on the shelf. "Carter, you will remove yourself from this property," Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way voices went quiet when the person using them was absolutely certain of what they were saying and had no interest in saying it more than once. "Now, and if you speak about a guest in my home in that manner again, we will have a different conversation." A pause. The sound of boots on the floor. The sound of the front door. Silence. Clara released the breath she'd been holding. She picked up the book again and placed it on the shelf in its correct position and moved to the next one. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway of the front room. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I heard," she said. She kept her voice even and did not turn around. "I apologize. He had no right." "You don't need to apologize for what other people say, Mr. Carter." She turned then, because it would have been strange not to, and looked at him directly. "I've been hearing things like that my whole life. I'm not broken by it." "That doesn't make it acceptable," he said. She looked at him. He meant it. It was not a performance of gallantry, not the reflexive chivalry of a man playing a role because someone was watching. He meant it the way people meant things when they'd actually thought about them. "No," she said after a moment. "It doesn't." The second thing that happened that afternoon was that Lillian fell off the back porch. Not far the step that was broken gave way when she landed on it coming down at speed, and she went sideways rather than straight down. And the result was a scraped elbow and a twisted ankle, and a startled cry that brought Clara out of the kitchen at a speed she didn't know she was capable of, and Nathaniel out of the barn at a dead run. They arrived at approximately the same moment. Lillian was sitting on the ground below the porch holding her elbow. Not crying, but making the controlled, shaky effort not to cry of a child who has decided that crying is no longer something she does. "I've got her," Clara said. She was already crouching, hands on Lillian's shoulders, checking. The ankle was swollen. The elbow was scraped but not deep. Nothing broken. "Look at me, sweetheart. Are you dizzy?" "No," Lillian said. Her voice was tight. "Does anything feel wrong inside? Not the scrape inside." "Just my ankle." "Okay." Clara looked up at Nathaniel, who was standing above her with his face doing the thing it had done when he'd looked at Lillian over dinner. The thing where 1 second of genuine feeling got through before the shutters came down. "Ankles twisted, elbows scraped, it'll need cleaning. Nothing serious." "That step," he said. "Get the step fixed," Clara said. And then, because she was still holding Lillian's shoulders, and Lillian was very still and trying very hard not to cry, Clara said, "Come here, Lillian," and opened her arms, and Lillian came into them with the speed of a child who had been waiting for someone to make that offer. Nathaniel Carter looked at the two of them, at his niece's face, finally releasing into the tears she'd been holding back, pressed against the shoulder of a woman who had shown up yesterday with a letter and a debt that wasn't hers. And whatever he felt in that moment looking at them was something he did not have language for and did not try to name. He went to find the carpenter to fix the step. By the time he came back, Clara had cleaned and dressed. Lillian's elbow wrapped the ankle with a length of linen she'd found in the medical kit, and settled the girl on the daybed in the back room with a glass of cold water and a book. She was reading aloud to Lillian from it. Something with adventure in it. Clara doing all the voices, and Lillian was listening with both the book and her elbow forgotten, caught up in whatever world Clara was building with her voice. Nathaniel stood in the hallway for a moment, where they couldn't see him. He stood there longer than he meant to. Then he went back to the barn because there was work to do, and because he needed to be somewhere he understood. That evening, after Lillian was in bed, and Mrs. Beaumont had retired, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Clara found Nathaniel on the front porch. He was sitting in one of the chairs there with a cup of coffee gone cold, looking out at the dark in the particular way of a man who was not seeing what he was looking at. "May I?" Clara said. He gestured to the other chair. She sat down. She did not immediately say anything, because she'd learned early that silence was not always a problem that needed solving. And Nathaniel Carter's silences in particular had a quality to them. A fullness, like water held in a container that felt wrong to puncture. After a while he said, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Know exactly what she needed, Lillian." He paused. "I've been trying to figure that out for 2 years, and I just..." He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to give her what she needs. I don't know what she needs. I try to give her stability, and I can see she's still..." "Lonely," Clara said. He was quiet. "Yes," he said. "She knows you love her," Clara said. "She told me so herself in her way. She protects you from having to talk about her grief so you won't feel like you're failing her." Clara paused. "Which means she's taking care of you. An 8-year-old is taking care of you." The silence that came after that had a different quality. Something in it was sharp. "I didn't know that," he said. "I know. She shouldn't have to do that." "No," Clara said. "She shouldn't." I was quiet for a moment. "How do I fix it?" "You talk to her," Clara said. "Not about solving it or making it better. Just you say her parents' names out loud. You let her know it's all right to be sad in your presence. That her grief isn't too much for you." She paused. "Is it too much for you?" "No." He said it immediately, with a certainty that surprised him. She thought the kind of certainty that arrived before the mind had time to qualify it. "No. She's everything I have. I just don't know how to..." "You don't have to know how," Clara said quietly. "You just have to show up." He looked at her, then turned his head and looked at her. Really looked the way he'd looked at her the first time, but different now because they'd been in the same house for nearly 36 hours, and she had moved through his life, and his daughter's life, and his kitchen, and his porch, and his conversation with the same steady, practical, unassuming presence that had somehow, without his noticing exactly when, made everything feel slightly less impossible. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. "You came here about a letter, a debt." "I did," she said. "You stayed and you cooked breakfast and you did the pantry and you taught Lillian long division and you held her when she fell." He shook his head slightly. "None of that was asked of you." "I know," Clara said. "I don't generally wait to be asked. Things need doing. I do them." "Why?" She thought about it. Then she said, "Because I walked into this house and I could see it was a house where someone had left and taken all the warmth with them, and the people left behind had gotten so used to the cold they'd stopped noticing it." She looked out at the dark. "I notice things. That's what I do." Nathaniel Carter was very still. "My wife," he said, after a long moment, carefully. "The way you said things you hadn't said out loud in a long time. Used to say that I worked too much, that I was better at managing a cattle operation than managing a household, that I knew how to run everything except—" He stopped. "Except the parts that weren't about running," Clara said. "Yes. Those are the parts Lillian needs." "I know. She doesn't need less love," Clara said. "She has plenty of that even when you don't say it. She needs you to be present in the room with her, even when you don't know what to say. Children don't need answers. They need company." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very simply, "Thank you." It was 2 words, and he meant all of them. Clara said, "Go talk to her. She's asleep. Tomorrow morning then, before breakfast. Go in and sit on the edge of her bed and say her mother's name. You don't have to say anything else." He looked at her. "That's all?" "Start there," Clara said. "The rest will follow." He nodded slowly. Then he stood, and the movement had the quality of a man who has just set something down that he's been carrying too long and is discovering with some surprise that his arms still work. "The debt," he said. He said it differently than he'd said it yesterday. Not as a business matter, but as something slightly uncomfortable, slightly incongruous in the context of the conversation they'd just been having. "It doesn't change," Clara said. "My father still owes you what he owes you. I wasn't going to—" "I know you weren't." She stood as well. "Whatever arrangement we make, Mr. Carter, about the household, about the debt, it should be one we can both look at clearly. I don't want to be confused about what I am here." He looked at her for a moment. "What do you think you are here?" "I think I'm still deciding," she said honestly. He nodded as though that were a perfectly reasonable answer. "So am I," he said. He went inside. Clara stayed on the porch a while longer in the dark and the enormous quiet of the Montana night. She was aware of a feeling in her chest, not the nameless sensation from this morning's kitchen, though it was related. This was something more specific, something that had weight and direction, like a compass needle finding north. She had spent 25 years being defined by what she was not. Not beautiful, not small, not the daughter anyone noticed, not the woman anyone chose. She had carried those definitions the way she'd carried her father's letter pressed against her chest, so familiar she'd stopped feeling the edges. But in the last day and a half in this house, nobody had introduced her by what she wasn't. They had introduced her by what she did. It was a small distinction. Or it seemed small the way the difference between a locked door and an unlocked door seemed small until you were on the wrong side of it. She stood on the porch and felt the night air on her face, and allowed herself quietly and without ceremony to feel something that was almost hope. Then she went inside, because tomorrow was a working day, and there was no virtue in standing on porches in the dark when there was sleeping to be done. 3 days passed. Clara reorganized the pantry and restocked it with a list she presented to Nathaniel, matter-of-factly, the way she'd have presented it to any employer, and he approved it without discussion. She overhauled the laundry system so that it ran in shifts rather than a single weekly ordeal, which saved Mrs. Beaumont 4 hours of labor and produced the first genuine unreserved smile the older woman had directed at anyone in what appeared to be some time. She continued Lillian's arithmetic lessons and discovered that the girl had a quick and inventive mind that had been sitting idle for lack of appropriate challenge, and she began adding reading comprehension and basic geography to the daily lessons which Lillian received with the focused pleasure of a person finally eating after a long fast. Nathaniel went into Lillian's room on the Tuesday morning before breakfast. Clara did not know what was said. She was in the kitchen, and she stayed there, and when Lillian came down to breakfast, her eyes were slightly pink at the edges, and Nathaniel's face had the specific softened quality of a man who has just done something hard and found that it mattered. Lillian sat down at the breakfast table and said, "Uncle Nathaniel told me about my mama." "Did he?" Clara said, putting a biscuit on her plate. "He said she laughed really loud, like embarrassingly loud. He said she'd laugh at things in church." "That sounds wonderful," Clara said. "It does, doesn't it?" Lillian said, and picked up her fork. After breakfast, Nathaniel stopped Clara in the hall. "Thank you," he said. "You did that," Clara said. "Not me." "You told me how." "You did it anyway." She looked at him. "Those are different things." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How long did you intend to stay?" "You said to look at the house and give you my honest assessment," Clara said. "I've been doing that. I haven't finished." "And when you finish, then I'll give you my assessment," she said. "And we'll figure out what comes next." It was, she thought later, probably the vaguest answer she'd ever given anyone. She was generally not a person who gave vague answers. But the honest truth was that she didn't know what came next, and she had given up sometime in the last 72 hours on the habit of pretending to know things she didn't know. On the fourth day, a visitor came to the ranch that changed everything. His name was Robert Langley, and he was a lawyer from Billings, and he arrived in a good suit and a bad mood, and he asked for Nathaniel Carter, with the crisp authority of a man who was used to his requests being immediately honored. Clara was in the study working through the household accounts with the methodical attention she brought to figures. She was good with numbers, had always been another thing nobody had ever thought to ask her about when she heard the voice in the front hall. She heard Nathaniel say, "Robert, I wasn't expecting you." "No," said Langley. "I don't imagine you were. Let's find somewhere to talk." Nathaniel said, "The study," and then presumably remembered. Clara heard his footsteps. The door opened. "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said with a quality in his voice she hadn't heard before controlled, but with something underneath that was not quite controlled. "Would you mind?" "Of course," Clara said, standing immediately and gathering the ledger pages in a neat stack. She carried them out past him and past the man in the suit who looked at her the way people looked at furniture, and she went down the hall to the kitchen and sat at the table there. The voices from the study were not loud enough to make out, but they went on for the better part of an hour. And when Langley left, she heard the front door, heard hoofbeats departing. Nathaniel did not come out of the study for a long time. When he did, he came to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the specific stillness of a man who is deciding whether to say something. "Bad news," Clara said. "Complicated news," he said. He came to the table and sat down across from her, which was the most informal thing he had done in the kitchen so far. "There's a claim against a piece of land I purchased 5 years ago. Northern section up against the timberline. Langley says it's being contested by a family named Pruitt, who say they have a prior deed." He paused. "The contested section is one of my 2 best winter grazing areas. Can Langley hold the claim?" He says possibly, with time and money. A great deal of both. He looked at her. "Which presents a problem." Clara looked at him. "You said the debt from my father wasn't a concern," she said carefully. "It wasn't," he said, "when I had more flexibility. Now," he stopped. "Now you need the money." He was quiet. There was something in his face, the specific discomfort of a proud man in a position he had not chosen and did not know how to manage gracefully. "I'm not going to take your father's house," he said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not that man." "I know," Clara said. "But I do need to think about how to restructure." "Let me look at the accounts," Clara said. He looked at her. "I've been working through them anyway," she said. "The household accounts. Let me look at the full books, ranch operations, the debt ledger, everything. I'm good with figures, and a second set of eyes sometimes finds things one set misses." "You're a housekeeper," he said, not unkindly, simply. "I'm Thomas Whitmore's daughter," Clara said, And for 3 years, I've been managing the household finances of a failing freight business on a budget that had no room for error whatsoever. I assure you, Mr. Carter, I know figures." She met his eyes. "Let me help." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, went back to the study, and came back with the full accounts ledger, which he set on the kitchen table in front of her. "I'll get us more coffee," he said. Clara opened the first page and got to work. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night when she found it. Not a solution exactly, but a possibility. There was a section of the southern pasture land that Nathaniel had purchased speculatively that he was not currently using for cattle operations. It was good land. The soil composition was clear from the notation in the records, but remote, and he'd not gotten around to developing it. The Billings Land Office, according to a clipping Nathaniel had kept in the back of the ledger from 3 months ago, was actively looking for land parcels for a proposed expansion of the rail line through that corridor. "You could sell the southern parcel," she said. "Not all of it. The eastern third. The rail line doesn't need the whole piece, and you'd keep the portion closest to your operations. The sale price based on the rail office's current land valuations," she showed him the clipping, "would be more than enough to cover Langley's legal fees and leave reserve capital." Nathaniel looked at the ledger, looked at the clipping, looked at her. "I didn't know about the rail expansion," he said. "It was in your own papers," she said. "I have a great deal of papers," he said, and it was the driest thing she'd heard him say. It surprised a laugh out of her, a brief, genuine sound that surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. He looked at her when she laughed, and something shifted in his expression, in the way things shifted when a person saw something they hadn't expected to see and did not know what to do with what they felt about it. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh," he said. "Is it?" She was still slightly surprised at herself. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't laugh very often." "Why not?" She thought about it. "I suppose I'm usually too busy to notice things that are funny." He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. Then he looked back at the ledger. "I'll write to the rail office tomorrow," he said. "Good." Clara closed the ledger and stood stretching her back. "Miss Whitmore." She looked at him. "I think," he said slowly, "that whatever arrangement we put in place—" He paused. He was choosing his words with the care of a man who was aware of their weight. "I think it should be something more permanent than a trial." Clara looked at him. "Are you offering me the housekeeper position?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Among other things I'm considering." She did not ask what the other things were. She said, "Let me think about it." He nodded, and she took the ledger back to the study and put it on the desk and went upstairs to her room, and she lay on the clean, simple bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the enormous Montana night around the house. "Among other things I'm considering, She thought about Lillian laughing at breakfast, about a mother who laughed too loud in church. She thought about the study with the meticulous order of a contained grief. She thought about the look on Nathaniel Carter's face when she laughed, the startled, specific look of a man who has heard a sound he didn't know he'd been waiting to hear. She thought about her father in the house in town waiting. She thought about the letter she'd carried against her ribs for 2 hours across a summer valley, pressed close like a wound. And she thought about the moment on the road when she had understood with the flat certainty of a woman who had run out of comfortable illusions that she was being sent because she was the one with nothing left to lose. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum where the letter had been, under her palm. Her heart was doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. It was not nothing. It was not the quiet, managed stillness she had trained herself to maintain. It was something alive and uncertain and frightening, and underneath the fright, something that felt, despite all reason, like the specific quality of a door that had just opened in a wall she'd thought had no doors. Clara Whitmore closed her eyes. Outside the window, the stars were exactly where they'd been the night before. Enormous and indifferent and brilliant, scattered across the Montana sky, with the lavish indiscrimination of a universe that did not know or care who deserved what. She didn't mind that tonight. Tonight that felt like enough. She told him she needed to think about it. That was Thursday night. By Friday morning, Clara had not stopped thinking about it for a single consecutive minute, which was its own kind of answer though, not one she was ready to say out loud. She came down to the kitchen at her usual hour, before the sun had fully committed to the day, and found Lillian already sitting at the kitchen table in her nightgown, with her arithmetic slate working through a problem she hadn't been assigned. "You're up early," Clara said. "I couldn't sleep," Lillian said without looking up. "I was thinking about the division problem, the one where you have to figure out how many times the number goes in before you know what's left over." She paused. "I think I've been doing the first part right. I just kept stopping too soon." Clara stood at the stove and listened to this, and felt something move through her that was not quite amusement, and not quite tenderness, but contained elements of both. "That's usually the problem," she said. "With most things." Lillian looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean people usually know the first part," Clara said. "It's the staying with it long enough to find out what's left over that's hard." Lillian considered this with her customary gravity. Then she looked back at her slate. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. The question was casual in the way children made questions, casual when they cared deeply about the answers and were trying not to show it. Clara set the coffee pot on the stove. "I'm thinking about it," she said. "Uncle Nathaniel thinks you should," Lillian said. "Did he tell you that?" "No, but I can tell." She erased something on her slate. "He talks differently when you're in the room, slower, like he's thinking about what he says before he says it." She paused. "He doesn't usually do that." Clara did not say anything for a moment. She measured out the coffee with the focused attention of someone who needs to do something with their hands. "Lillian," she said, "you notice a great deal." "Somebody has to," Lillian said simply, and went back to her division. Nathaniel came down 20 minutes later, and breakfast was served, and the morning moved through its ordinary business. But twice during the meal, Clara caught him looking at her with the expression she had been cataloging privately over the past 4 days, the one she had initially categorized as attentiveness, and was now reclassifying as something she didn't have a clean word for. Something that was attentiveness, plus something else. Something with weight in it. After the hands went out, and Mrs. Beaumont began clearing the table, Nathaniel said, "Walk with me." It was the first time he'd asked her to do anything that was not functional. They walked out past the barn, along the fence line that bordered the northern pasture. Nathaniel walked with his hands in his pockets and his hat tipped forward against the morning glare. And for a while, neither of them said anything, which would have been comfortable, except for the specific tension of two people who both have something to say and are each waiting for the other to say it first. Nathaniel said it first. "I want to be honest with you," he said, "about what I meant last night, when I said there were other things I was considering." "All right," Clara said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "This ranch needs someone," he said. "Not a housekeeper, not an employee. Someone who is here because they choose to be here. Someone who—" He paused, and the pause had in it the quality of a careful man choosing not to be careless. "Lillian needs a woman in this house. Someone steady. Someone who will be here tomorrow and the month after and the year after." He looked at her directly. "I've been thinking since the night you arrived that the most honest thing I could offer you, and the most honest thing I could offer this house, would be to ask you to be my wife." Clara looked at him. The morning was very still around them. In the distance, cattle moved against the fence line. The sky above Montana was doing what it did in the early summer morning, all that impossible blue. "That is not what I expected you to say," she said. "I know. We have known each other 4 days. I know that too. You're not—" She stopped, sorted her thoughts with the methodical care she brought to accounts ledgers. "You're not saying this because of the debt?" "No. Or out of charity?" "No." He said it without hesitation, and with the flat certainty of a man who had already examined every angle of the question and arrived at the same answer regardless of where he came from. "I am saying it because I have watched you in this house for 4 days, and I have seen what you are, and what you are is—" He stopped. Something crossed his face. The effort of a man who is not naturally given to this kind of language, finding that it is necessary. "You're the kind of person who fixes things that aren't yours to fix." Who shows up before she's asked and stays longer than she promised? Who holds a child she met 3 days ago when that child is frightened and makes it feel like the most natural thing in the world? He looked at her. I haven't seen that in this house in a very long time. Clara was quiet. And what would I be getting? She said. Not bitterly, practically, with the honest practicality of a woman who needed to see all sides of a ledger before she committed to the figures. This ranch, security for my family, a position in this valley. Those are real things, Mr. Carter, and I don't dismiss them. But what would you be getting that you couldn't get from a more suitable arrangement? I told you, he said. I don't want a servant who feels grateful. I want... He paused. I want someone who will tell me the truth. Who will come to my kitchen at 5 in the morning because there are biscuits to make, and not because anyone told her to. Who will sit on my porch at night and tell me I'm failing my niece and be right. He looked at her steadily. Someone who makes this house feel like the thing it stopped being 4 years ago. A home, Clara said. Yes. She looked at him. Then she looked out at the pasture, at the cattle, at the fence line that went on until it reached the tree line, which went on until it reached the sky. I will give you my answer, she said, when I've thought about it properly. Not today. That's fair, he said. And Mr. Carter? She looked at him. If I say yes, it won't be because of the debt. It won't be because I'm grateful. And it won't be because I have no better option. I know, he said. I want to be sure you know. Clara. It was the first time he had used her first name. He said it quietly with the simple directness of a man who had decided something. I know. She went back inside. He went to the barn. Mrs. Beaumont, who had the particular radar of experienced older women, said nothing at all, but put a fresh cup of coffee on the counter next to Clara without being asked, and Clara picked it up and drank it, and did not say anything either. The town came to the ranch 3 days later. Not the whole town, but enough of it that it felt that way. It was a Sunday, which was the day that people in the valley moved around, more freely finished their obligations, and found their way toward each other's business. Clara had been at the Carter Ranch for a week. That week had traveled through the valley the way things traveled in small communities, not through any single declaration, but through accumulated observation, through the dry goods store, and the church steps, and the conversations between fence posts. People had noted that Thomas Whitmore's daughter had ridden out to the Carter Ranch and had not come back, and they had constructed around this fact the architecture of assumption that communities always built when they had information without context. Clara was in the front yard with Lillian, who was practicing her letters by writing them in the dirt with a stick when the buggy came down the road. 3 women. Clara recognized 2 of them. Martha Greer, the wife of the hardware store owner, and Sandra Pruitt, whose family name appeared in the land claim Nathaniel's lawyer was contesting, which was a coincidence that Clara noted and filed away without expression. The third woman she did not know by name, but recognized by type. They stopped at the gate. Martha Greer called out, "Morning, Miss Whitmore." "Morning," Clara said pleasantly. "We heard you were out here helping Carter. Thought we'd come pay a call." Martha's voice had the bright surface friendliness that covered a much more complex intention underneath, like a fresh coat of paint on a wall that was structurally unsound. "How are you getting on?" "Very well, thank you," Clara said. "Must be a change from home," Sandra Pruitt said. She said it with a particular sweetness that had edges. "Your family's place is modest, isn't it? This ranch is something different altogether." Clara looked at Sandra Pruitt with the steady, patient attention she gave to arithmetic problems. "Yes," she said. "It's a well-run operation. We heard you've been doing the cooking, the housekeeping." This was the third woman whose name Clara still didn't know. She said it in the tone of someone offering information they expected to be shameful. "For Mr. Carter." "Among other things," Clara said. Martha Greer's eyes moved to Lillian, then back to Clara. "And the little girl. Are you managing her as well?" "We do lessons together," Clara said. "Lillian is very bright." Lillian looked up from her letters and regarded the women with the dark, patient eyes that saw everything and gave away nothing. "Miss Whitmore," Sandra Pruitt said, dropping the sweetness by 1 fraction. I'll be straight with you since we're all women here. People in town are talking. You've been out here a week, unchaperoned, in a widower's house." She paused, loading the next words with the weight she intended them to carry. "Your father's debt to Carter is common knowledge. People are wondering what arrangement has been made." "Are they?" Clara said. "They are. And I think you know a woman in your position with your circumstances." Another pause. The kind that invited the listener to fill in what wasn't being said. "You have to be careful about how things look." Clara was quiet for a moment. She had heard some version of this her entire life. The implication that she was lucky to be noticed, that she should be careful not to presume that women of her size and station occupied a narrow and precarious territory where any misstep could cost them the little they had. She had absorbed it so many times that it had become a kind of atmospheric condition, something she moved through without actively noticing, the way you stopped noticing the smell of your own house. She noticed it now. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said, "I appreciate your concern." Her voice was calm, measured, unhurried. "The arrangement at the Carter Ranch is between myself and Mr. Carter, and is being managed with full propriety, and Mrs. Beaumont's constant presence. What people in town are wondering is not something I can control, and is not something I propose to lose sleep over." She looked at the three women evenly. "As for my circumstances, I find I'm managing them rather well, thank you." Sandra Pruitt's mouth thinned. "You should know," she said with the sweetness gone entirely now, "that Carter could have any woman in this valley. There are families." She meant her own. Clara understood, and possibly others she'd been speaking for, who have considered an alliance with him. Proper families, with standing. "Then I'm sure those families will make their interest known through appropriate channels," Clara said. "Good morning." She turned back to Lillian and the letters in the dirt. The buggy did not move for a moment. Then it moved. Lillian was looking up at Clara with those serious dark eyes. "They were mean to you," she said. "They were worried about things that aren't really about me," Clara said. "There's a difference." "I don't see what it is." "When people are mean because they're afraid," Clara said, "it's usually because they think you have something they want. That's not about you, that's about them." Lillian thought about this. "What do they think you have?" Clara picked up a stick and wrote the letter G in the dirt next to Lillian's H. "That," she said, "is a very good question." She didn't have an answer yet, but she thought she was getting closer to one. Nathaniel had not been present for the visit of the three women. He had been out on the North Range with two of his hands dealing with a stretch of fence that had come down overnight. He came back mid-afternoon with dust on his coat and a look on his face that said the fence situation had been more complicated than anticipated, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and read Clara's expression with the same careful attention he gave to everything. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing important," Clara said. "Clara." She looked at him. She had still not gotten used to him using her first name, not because it was unwelcome, but because it arrived each time with a particular quality, like a hand placed on a door that has never been opened from the outside. "Sandra Pruitt and Martha Greer and another woman paid a call this morning," she said. He was very still. "What did they say?" "What people say," Clara said. "About my being here, about propriety, about your options in the valley being considerably broader than the current situation suggests." Something moved across his face. Something that was close to anger, but more controlled than anger. The specific restraint of a man who has trained himself not to express what he felt about the way the world treated people he'd decided to care about. "I'll speak to Martha Greer's husband," he said. "You will not," Clara said. He looked at her. "I handled it," she said. "I don't need you to manage the conversation after the fact. That makes it about you. It stays about me if I handle it myself." A pause. "You're right," he said. "I know." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Also, Sandra Pruitt's family is contesting your land claim. I don't know if that's related to the visit, but I thought you should know. I noticed." He took the coffee and looked at her. "How do you think of these things?" "I told you," she said. "I notice things." He drank his coffee. Then he said, "Clara, I want to tell you something." "All right. When I asked you what I asked you out by the fence, I wasn't thinking about the Pruitts or the Greers or what anyone in this valley thinks about the arrangement. He set the cup down. I was thinking about this house, about Lillian, about... He stopped. Started again. About the last 4 days, which have been the first 4 days in a long time when this house felt like it was breathing. Clara looked at him. That's what you do, he said. You make things breathe. And I know it's too soon, and I know I'm asking for more than I have a right to ask. But I want you to know that what I'm asking because of who you are. Not what you can do for me. Not the debt. Not the town. He met her eyes directly. You. The kitchen was very quiet around them. Clara set down the dish she was holding. She did not look away from him. Nathaniel, she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She hadn't planned to. It arrived because it was necessary, because the formality of Carter had become inadequate for what the moment required. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it plainly. All right, he said. I have spent my entire life being told in one way or another that I am the option people take when better options aren't available. That I am the practical choice. The convenient one. The one who is useful. Her voice was steady. Completely steady. Not the steadiness of someone holding themselves together, but the steadiness of someone who has already arrived somewhere they intend to be. If I say yes to what you're asking, and I am not saying yes right now, I'm telling you what yes would mean. It will not be because I am useful here, or because your house needs someone, or because my father's debt needs a solution. It will be because I choose to. Because I look at you, and I see a man who is trying imperfectly and genuinely to do right by the people who need him. And because I look at Lillian, and I see a child who deserves to have a woman in her life who doesn't leave. She paused. Those are the things that would make me say yes. Not security, not arrangement, not obligation. He looked at her for a long time. I understand, he said. Do you, Clara? He said her name again in that quiet, deliberate way. I hear you. Every word. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she said, I'll give you my answer tomorrow. I'll be here, he said. That night, Clara sat down and wrote a letter to her father. She did not write it to ask permission. She was 25 years old and had been managing her own life and everyone else's for long enough that the question of permission was not the question she was grappling with. She wrote it because Thomas Whitmore deserved honesty from his daughter, even when his daughter had more cause than most to give him something less. Papa, she wrote, I came here carrying something that belonged to you. I understand why you sent me. I don't hold it against you the way I did for the first 2 hours on the road. I want you to understand something clearly. Whatever happens from here, I am not doing it to save the family. I am doing it because for the first time in a very long time, I am in a place where someone looks at me and sees who I am before they see what I look like or what I cost them. I am doing it because I choose to. I will write again soon. Your daughter, Clara. She sealed it and left it on the front table for the Morning Post writer. Then she went to bed and then slept for the first time in a week without lying awake thinking. She had her answer. She gave it to him the next morning in the kitchen before the fire was fully built and the coffee was still coming to its temperature. She said, yes. He looked at her. Because I choose to, she said. Not for any other reason. I know, he said. And then quietly, with the simplicity of a man who had learned not to waste words on things that didn't need them. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, she said. We haven't told the town. What the town said, and how loudly it said, it was something neither of them were fully prepared for, though Clara was less surprised than Nathaniel, because she had spent more time being the subject of a town's opinion, and had developed of necessity a more realistic understanding of its behavior. The announcement of their engagement, which Nathaniel made with the methodical directness he brought to most things, in a conversation with the county clerk, and a notice sent to the newspaper landed on the valley like a stone in still water. The ripples were immediate and widespread and not uniformly charitable. The women who came into the dry goods store talked about it. The men who gathered at the feed supplier talked about it. the preacher's wife who had opinions about everything and the energy to express them publicly, said she hoped Mr. Carter knew what he was doing. Sandra Pruitt, whose visit Clara had not forgotten and did not intend to, was reported to have said that it was convenient, wasn't it, how the debt had been settled. The implication, the one that spread most efficiently through the community because it had the satisfying shape of a cynical explanation, was that Nathaniel had offered marriage as a solution to a financial problem, and Clara had taken it because what else was a woman like her going to do? Clara heard these things through Mrs. Beaumont, who reported them with the combination of indignation and practicality of a woman who believed the truth should be known and also understood that knowing it and being able to change it were different problems. "Does it bother you?" Mrs. Beaumont asked one morning after delivering the latest installment of the Valley's opinion. "It bothers me the way a headache bothers me," Clara said. "Unpleasant, not fatal." "You're more patient than I'd be." "You'd be more patient than you think," Clara said. "People believe what's easiest. An obvious story is easier than a complicated one." "I am not a simple story, Mrs. Beaumont. Simple stories don't usually require patience." Mrs. Beaumont looked at her. "No," she said slowly. "I don't suppose they do." What surprised Clara was where the opposition came from that mattered. She had braced herself for the town's opinion. She had not fully prepared herself for Marcus. Her brother arrived at the Carter Ranch on a Tuesday, 12 days after the engagement announcement, on a horse he'd borrowed without asking, and in a state of agitation he had not bothered to contain before he arrived. He was in the front yard before Clara knew he was coming, and he called her name with the particular edge of a young man who has convinced himself that the righteous anger carrying him is entirely justified. "Marcus," she said, coming out to meet him. "You should have—" "What have you done?" he said. Not to her exactly, at her. "You rode out here to deliver a letter, and now you're what?" "Marrying him. You've been here 2 weeks, Clara." "Yes," she said. "Mama's barely been in the ground 3 years, and Papa is—" He stopped, collecting himself with visible effort. "People in town are saying they're saying he bought you, that he got the debt cleared cheap by taking you on instead of—" "I know what they're saying," Clara said. And it isn't true." "But how do you know?" His voice cracked slightly on it, not from cruelty, but from genuine fear. She realized the fear of a younger brother who had not until this moment thought much about his older sister's inner life, and was now confronting the fact that he had been negligent about it. "You've been here 2 weeks. You don't know this man. You don't know what he—" "Marcus." She said it clearly, and something in the way she said it made him stop. "Look at me." He looked at her. "I am not a woman who was purchased," she said. "I am not a solution that was conveniently located. I came here with Papa's letter, and I met this man, and I saw his house, and I saw what his house needed, and I saw his niece who has been alone in a way no child should be alone, and I made a decision that belongs to me." She held his eyes. "The first decision in my life that was entirely, completely mine. Not because I had no choice. Because I had every choice, and I chose this one." Marcus stared at her. "He's a good man, Marcus," she said. "Not perfect. Shut in on himself in ways that are going to take time to open. But good. The kind of good that holds even when it's inconvenient." She paused. "He threw Dale Creston off his property for saying something disrespectful about me 2 days after I arrived. He didn't tell me about it afterward to impress me. I heard it through the wall." A silence. "He did," Marcus said. "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. Then he looked up. "Papa feels terrible," he said, "about sending you. He hasn't said it right because he doesn't know how, but he—" "I know," Clara said. "I wrote to him. It's all right." "Is it?" She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "It will be," she said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Looked at her the way she thought he perhaps had not looked at her in years, if ever. Seeing her. Not her size or her circumstances or her usefulness. Her. "You look different," he said finally. "Different how?" "Like you're—" He struggled for it. "Like you're somewhere you meant to be." Clara said nothing. But something moved through her face that was not a smile exactly, but carried all the weight of one. "Go inside," she said. "Mrs. Beaumont will feed you." He went inside. Clara stood in the yard for a moment with the sun on her shoulders and the sound of the ranch around her and the specific quality of a woman who had just defended her own life out loud and found that it sounded exactly the way she'd hoped it would. Then she went in to introduce her brother to Nathaniel Carter. The meeting between the two men was careful and not quite comfortable, and better than it might have been, which Clara counted as a success. Nathaniel shook Marcus's hand with the directness of a man who was not intimidated by the situation and was also not going to perform warmth he hadn't yet earned. Marcus shook back with the wariness of a young man who wanted to find fault and was having difficulty locating it. Lillian sat at the table and watched the whole thing with her chin in her hand and the expression of a theater critic in the front row. When Marcus left that afternoon, he was not converted, but he was quieter than he'd arrived, which was its own form of progress. "Your brother is protective of you," Nathaniel said afterward. "He's discovering that he should have been sooner," Clara said. "It's uncomfortable for him." "Is it uncomfortable for you?" She thought about it. "A little, but it's good discomfort." She looked at him. "The kind that means something is changing." He nodded slowly. "I want you to know," he started. "Nathaniel." He stopped. "I know," she said. A pause. Then something that was not quite a smile but carried the warmth of one. "You do that," he said. "Know what I'm going to say." "Sometimes," she said. "Not always. You're not as easy to read as you think." "I don't think I'm easy to read at all." "You're not," she agreed. "But you have tells." "What tells?" "When you're worried about something, you look at the floor for exactly 3 seconds and then look back up," she said. "When something pleases you, your jaw relaxes. When you're deciding whether to say something honest or something careful, you go quiet for a moment too long." He was looking at her with the expression she had stopped being able to pretend was simply attentive. "You've been studying me," he said. "I told you," she said. "I notice things." "Clara." He took a step toward her. Not dramatic, simply a step the way a man moved toward something he'd decided on. "I'm going to say something honest." "All right. I don't know yet how to be what you deserve," he said. "I've been shut in on myself long enough that the opening up is—" He searched for it. "It's slower than I'd like, and I know that's not fair to you, but I want you to know that I'm trying. That every morning I wake up in this house and I think about what I can do differently that day. And that has not been true for me in a very long time." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Nathaniel," she said. "You got up and went into Lillian's room and said her mother's name out loud." He nodded. "And the morning after that you asked her what her favorite memory was, and you listened for 20 minutes while she told you about a picnic your sister made with the wrong kind of bread that everyone complained about and laughed about anyway." He nodded again. "That," Clara said, "is not a man who doesn't know how to open up. That is a man who forgot that he knew how. There's a difference." She held his gaze. "You're remembering. That's all you need to do." The quiet that followed had the specific quality, the full, still particular quality of two people who have arrived at the same understanding from different directions and are resting in it together for the first time. Then Nathaniel Carter did something he had not done in 4 years. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any declaration. He simply reached out and took her hand in his, the way a person reached for something they needed and held it. Clara did not pull away. She looked down at their joined hands. His large and work roughened hers, broad and steady, and then she looked up at him, and she let him see in her face what she had been careful up until this moment to hold back. The fear, the hope, the particular hard-won certainty of a woman who had spent 25 years being invisible, and was now in this kitchen, in this house she had walked into, carrying someone else's debt and her own bruised dignity, becoming visible in the only way that had ever mattered, not to the town, to herself. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." Outside, the Montana afternoon was doing what afternoons did, moving through its light, indifferent to the particular weight of the moment inside the kitchen. The cattle were at the fence. The men were at their work. Lillian was in the schoolroom with a slate full of figures she was mostly getting right. And in the kitchen, Nathaniel Carter held Clara Whitmore's hand, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The thing that came next came without warning, the way the things that changed everything always did. It was 3 days before the wedding date. They had quietly set small practical, just the preacher and Mrs. Beaumont and Lillian and Marcus. If he could bring himself to be present without reservation, when Nathaniel came in from the North Range at midday, with his face carrying a look that Clara had not seen before. Not worry, not anger, something graver. "The Pruitt claim," he said. "It's been escalated." Clara set down what she was holding. "What does that mean?" "It means Robert Langley thinks they have a document we weren't aware of," he said. "A prior deed from before the territory mapping. If it holds—" He stopped. "If it holds, I lose the north grazing section and about a third of my winter feeding capacity. The herd would need to be reduced significantly. The operation. Another stop." He was very still in the way he got still when something was serious. "It would survive, but it would not be what it is now." Clara looked at him. "And the rail land sale. Not enough to offset it if the claim holds." "How long to determine if it holds?" "Langley says 6 months minimum. Could be a year." She was quiet for a moment, running figures in her head. She had been running figures in this household for 2 weeks, and she knew the numbers with the intimacy of someone who had lived inside them. She knew where the margins were. She knew where the pressures were. She knew exactly how a 30% reduction in winter grazing capacity would move through the operation like a stone through water. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "This changes nothing," she said. "About us. About the wedding. I need you to hear that immediately and not question it." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face. "Clara." "I did not say yes because of your land," she said. "I said yes because of you. If the land claim reduces this operation, we manage what we have. I am not a woman who changes her mind because circumstances change." She held his gaze. "Are you—" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No." "Good." She turned back to the stove. "Then sit down and tell me everything Langley said, and we'll look at the accounts this evening and figure out what the contingency looks like. Together." He sat. And that word "together" landed in the kitchen between them, with the quiet, definitive weight of something that had been true for some time and was only now being named out loud. Clara kept her back to him for a moment, her hands steady on the stove. She allowed herself in the privacy of that moment to feel the full scope of what she had walked into on that dusty summer road 2 weeks ago with her father's letter pressed against her ribs. She had come here with nothing to lose. She understood now with the absolute clarity of someone who had done the arithmetic all the way to the end what that had actually meant. It hadn't meant she was worthless. It had meant she was free. They were married on a Saturday morning 3 days after Nathaniel told her about the Pruitt land claim. The preacher came out to the ranch rather than the other way around, which Nathaniel had arranged without being asked, because he understood without needing it, explained that Clara walking into the town church as the subject of its collective opinion was not the beginning she deserved. The ceremony was in the front room, the same front room Clara had catalogued on her second morning as bare and impersonal and hotel-like. She had done nothing dramatic to it. She had put a cloth on the table by the window and set on it a jar of the roses from the back fence, the scraggly ones that had been fighting on their own for years and were still producing blooms despite everything. Small thing. But the room looked different. It looked for the first time like a place where something real might happen. Mrs. Beaumont stood to one side with her hands folded and her expression composed into the particular dignity of a woman who felt things deeply and had long ago decided that feelings were not public property. Lillian stood beside her in her good dress, with her dark braids freshly done, holding a small bunch of wildflowers she had gathered herself that morning without being asked and presented to Clara at breakfast, without ceremony setting them on the table, and then immediately going back to her biscuit, as though she hadn't done anything remarkable. Marcus came. He came without reservation, which was not nothing. He stood next to Mrs. Beaumont, and he watched his sister and Clara, saw him see her. Really see her, the way he'd started to. The afternoon he'd ridden out in his borrowed horse Agitation, and she'd defended her own life at him in the front yard. He saw her, and whatever he saw made him stand up straighter, which was the most honest thing he could have done. The ceremony was short. The preacher was a practical man who understood that the words themselves carried the weight and didn't need ornamentation. When he asked Clara if she took Nathaniel Carter to be her husband, she said, "I do," in the same voice she'd used when she told Nathaniel she would look at his house steady and clear and already decided no performance in it. When Nathaniel placed the ring on her finger, a plain gold band he had chosen with the same simple directness he brought to most things. He held her hand for a moment, after just a moment, the way he had held it in the kitchen 3 days ago. A small thing. Clara felt it all the way through. "Lillian." At the precise moment the preacher said, "I now pronounce you," made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed noise of satisfaction, which she covered immediately by looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had not made any sound at all. Mrs. Beaumont put a hand over her mouth. Marcus looked at the floor. Clara looked at Nathaniel. He was already looking at her. "Well," he said quietly just for her. "Well," she said back. Mrs. Beaumont had made a cake, which she produced from the kitchen, with the air of someone who had been planning this, and was not going to let anyone pretend it wasn't a significant occasion. They ate it at the long table, where the ranch hands ate breakfast, and the ranch hands came in one by one to offer their congratulations with the hat-in-hand awkwardness of working men unaccustomed to sentiment, and Clara thanked each one of them, and meant it, because they had accepted her presence in the kitchen and around the property without the particular resistance she'd expected, and that had mattered to her even when she hadn't said so. By afternoon the ranch was back to its regular business. Cattle didn't pause for weddings. The north fence that had come down again needed attending. 2 of the hands had a dispute about a tool that required Nathaniel's arbitration. Life on a working ranch operated on its own schedule, without reference to the personal occasions of the people running it, and Clara had understood this from the beginning, and found it in its way a relief. There was no space for excessive sentiment when there was always something that needed doing. She was in the kitchen at 4 o'clock, working through the week's supply inventory, when Nathaniel came in. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her, at his wife sitting at the kitchen table with an accounts ledger and a cup of tea, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world, which it was not, and also somehow already was. "How are you?" he said. "I'm good," she said. And then, because honesty had been the foundation of everything between them, and she saw no reason to depart from it, "I'm a little frightened." He came in and sat across from her. "Of what?" "Of needing this," she said. She looked at him directly. "I've managed a very long time by not needing much. Needing something it's a different way to live." "I know," he said. "Are you frightened?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes." "Of what?" "Of not being enough," he said, plainly. The way he said hard things when he'd decided to say them. "Of getting this wrong the way I've gotten other things wrong. Of—" He stopped. "You came here and in 2 weeks you made this house into something I hadn't seen in 4 years. I'm frightened that you'll look around one day and realize the house was the project and there isn't enough left to stay for." Clara put down her pen. "Nathaniel," she said, "look at me." He looked. "I did not marry your house," she said. "I married you. The house was already good. It just needed someone to remind it." She held his gaze. "You are the same." He was very still. "I'm going to need you to believe that," she said. "Not today necessarily, but I'm going to need you to work toward it, because I can't be the only person in this marriage who thinks you're worth staying for." A silence. "I'll work toward it," he said. "Good," she said, and picked up her pen. "Now let me finish this inventory before supper, or we'll be short on salt pork by Thursday." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he looked back down at the table. Almost was enough. Almost was more than enough. The first real test came 6 days after the wedding, and it came in the form of a cattle crisis that nobody had anticipated, and that arrived with the swift, indifferent brutality of everything that went wrong on working ranches. A sickness moved through the southern herd. It started with 3 animals showing signs on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday noon had spread to 11, with 2 of those looking critical. The ranch hand who managed the cattle health, a weathered man named Pete Aldous, who had been with Nathaniel 7 years and whose opinion on cattle matters was essentially final, told Nathaniel straight that if they didn't isolate the affected animals completely and immediately, they were looking at a potential loss of 30 to 40% of the southern herd. Nathaniel went into the kind of controlled, focused efficiency that Clara recognized now as his response to genuine crisis. The shutters didn't come down. They opened, which was the opposite of what she'd expected, and told her something important about the kind of man he actually was under pressure. He was in the barn before Pete finished talking. He had men deployed and animals moving within the hour. Clara did not wait to be told what was needed. She went to the kitchen and started cooking at a scale she hadn't attempted since the ranch's breakfast rotation, because the hands who were going to spend the next 48 hours managing sick cattle and isolation pens were going to need to eat, and the normal meal rotation wasn't built for a crisis. She commandeered Mrs. Beaumont without ceremony, and the two of them built a system between them without speaking much about it, in the way that competent women working in the same space sometimes did, each understanding what the other was doing and building around it rather than negotiating. By midday Wednesday, there was food available at the ranch house on a continuous basis, rotating through what the kitchen could produce timed, so that something hot was always ready for whoever came in from the field. Clara kept track of which men had eaten and which hadn't, the way she kept track of figures not on paper in her head, constant and automatic. Pete Aldous came in at 2 in the afternoon, covered in the specific exhaustion of a man who had been doing hard physical work under emotional stress since before dawn. He sat at the table, and Clara put a plate in front of him without being asked, and poured his coffee without being asked, and said nothing except, "How are they doing?" "Holding," Pete said. "The 2 critical ones are still standing. That's good." He drank his coffee. "Mrs. Carter." He said the name with the slight adjustment of a man still calibrating to a new reality. "You don't have to do all this." "I know," Clara said. "Eat." He ate. On Thursday morning, Nathaniel came into the kitchen at 5:30, looking like a man who had not slept and was not going to mention it. Clara was already at the stove. She handed him coffee without ceremony and said, "Pete says the critical 2 are holding. One of them turned a corner overnight," he said. "The other one I'm not sure about yet." "What do you need from the house today?" He looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her when she was a housekeeper, or an arrangement, or a problem to be solved. The way he'd been looking at her increasingly since the night on the porch. Like she was something he was still learning the shape of and kept finding larger than he'd measured. "What you're doing," he said. "Keep doing what you're doing." "Already am," she said. The second critical animal survived. They lost a cow that had been older and less able to fight the sickness, and Pete called it on Friday morning with the matter-of-fact gravity of a man who understood loss as part of the work and did not pretend otherwise. Nathaniel was there when it happened. Clara saw him come back from that part of the property, with his face arranged in the controlled stillness he used when something had cost him, and she said nothing about it because there was nothing to say, and she made sure there was food ready and let him be still until he wasn't. That evening he said, "We kept the herd." "You kept the herd," Clara said. "Pete kept the herd. The men kept the herd." "You made the decisions in the first 2 hours that made everything else possible," she said. "That was you." He was quiet. "We lost 1 animal," he said. "Yes. I keep thinking about what I could have done differently, whether I caught it early enough, whether—" "Nathaniel." She said it quietly. "You will always find something you could have done differently. That's how good people think. But your herd is alive because you acted fast and correctly, and because you have men who trust you enough to move when you say move." She looked at him. "Take the win." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're very good at that." "At what?" "Cutting through to the thing I need to hear." "You make it easy," she said. "You listen." He looked at her. "Most people don't think I listen." "Most people aren't watching closely enough," she said. Something moved through his face, something that had been happening more frequently over the past week. This loosening, this quality of a man slowly setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing it was there. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "I'm glad you stayed." She held his gaze. "So am I," she said. The town came to the ranch again on the following Sunday, but this time it came differently. It came because word had traveled. The way? Word traveled in the Montana Territory, not through newspapers, but through the organic underground telegraph of community, that the Carter Ranch had weathered a cattle crisis that had looked at its worst potentially ruinous and had come out the other side with most of the herd intact. And that the new Mrs. Carter had fed every hand on that ranch continuously for 72 hours without pause or complaint. Pete Aldous had a wife in town. He'd talk to her. She'd talk to others. That was how it worked. The visitors that Sunday were not Sandra Pruitt and her contingent of sweetly edged skepticism. They were neighbors, genuine neighbors, the kind that showed up with a covered dish and an offer of help after a hard week, because that was what neighbors did in country that demanded cooperation to survive. An older woman named Vera Hutchins brought a pie and stayed for an hour and talked about cattle sickness with the authority of someone who had lost half a herd in the winter of 1878 and rebuilt it. A family named Calloway sent their oldest son with a side of smoked pork and an invitation for Nathaniel to come look at a bull they had that might suit his breeding program. Clara received them in the front room, the room with the table by the window and the jar of fighting roses, with the ease of a woman who had been managing hospitality her whole life and was simply now doing it in a different house. Vera Hutchins sat in the good chair and looked around the room and said, "This house looks different." "Does it?" Clara said. "I came here once 2 years ago. Something about a property boundary question." She looked at Clara with the direct appraisal of an older woman who had long ago stopped managing her own observations. It was cold, not temperature, cold. She looked around again. "It's not cold now." "Thank you," Clara said. "Was that you or him?" Clara thought about it. "Both of us, I think," she said. "He was always the warmth. He'd just put it somewhere he couldn't reach." Vera Hutchins looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You're not what I expected." "People keep telling me that," Clara said. "Maybe that says more about expectations than it does about you," Vera said and accepted a second cup of coffee. What Clara did not know, because she was in the front room with Vera Hutchins, was that Nathaniel was around the back of the house with Vera's husband Harold, who was a quiet man in his 60s, with a farmer's hands and a direct way of speaking. And Harold Hutchins was saying to Nathaniel, with the bluntness of a man who had decided the other man deserved plain speech, "Town's been talking about your marriage." "I know," Nathaniel said. "Not all of it unkindly," Harold said. "I want you to know that. Some of it's been unkind. Sandra Pruitt's been running her mouth about it in a way I don't care for, and I told my wife to say so." He paused. "But a good portion of what I've heard is people noticing that your ranch came through a hard week and wondering how much of that was the woman you married." Nathaniel was quiet. "A lot of it," he said. Harold nodded. "That's what I thought." He looked at the fence line. "Good woman's not a small thing, Carter. Men in this territory go a long time thinking they don't need one, and then they find out they do." He paused. "Where'd she come from, really, before the debt business?" "Whitmore family," Nathaniel said. "Thomas's oldest." "I know Thomas. Good man who made a bad run of luck." Harold paused. "And she just—" He gestured vaguely. "She rode out here with his letter," Nathaniel said. She was the most honest person I'd talked to in 2 years, in the first hour." He paused, looking for the right words, which did not come easily to him in this context. "She walked into my house and she saw everything that was wrong with it, and she didn't say a word about any of it. She just started fixing things." Harold Hutchins looked at him. "And you married her?" "Yes." "Fast?" "Yes." Harold was quiet for a moment. "My wife and I were married in under a month," he said. 41 years ago, my mother thought I'd lost my mind." He adjusted his hat. "My mother came around eventually." Nathaniel looked at him. Harold said, "The town will come around. Give it time and give them reasons. Looks to me like you're already doing the second part." He went back inside to find his wife. Nathaniel stood by the fence for a moment. He thought about what Harold had said. He thought about Clara in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, handing him coffee without ceremony. He thought about her telling him to take the win. He thought about her on the porch the first night saying, "I decide what I am here." He thought about the ring on her finger, and the roses in the jar, and the way the front room didn't feel like a hotel anymore. He went back inside his house. His home. The distinction had been theoretical for 4 years. It wasn't theoretical anymore. The Pruitt land claim came to its first significant moment 3 weeks after the wedding, when Robert Langley rode out from Billings with a document case and an expression that Clara, watching from the porch, classified immediately as the expression of a lawyer who has news that is complicated rather than simply good or simply bad. She brought coffee to the study and left it without being asked, and closed the door behind her without listening at it, because she trusted Nathaniel to tell her what she needed to know and had no interest in information she'd taken by stealth. She was in the kitchen an hour later when the study door opened and both men came out. Langley had the look of a man who had done his job and knew it, but was uncertain whether the client was satisfied. Nathaniel had his controlled crisis face, but underneath it, something else, something that Clara needed a moment to identify. She identified it. Relief. Langley left 20 minutes later. Nathaniel came to the kitchen and sat at the table. "Tell me," Clara said. "The Pruitt deed is real," he said. Langley confirmed it. "There is a prior claim on the north section." Clara was still. And, Nathaniel said with the specific care of a man delivering information that has more layers than it appears. "The deed is real, but it belongs to Edgar Pruitt, not his son James, who filed the claim. Edgar Pruitt is 81 years old and lives in Helena, and has no knowledge that his son filed this claim using a copy of his deed without his authorization." Clara set down her coffee cup. "James Pruitt filed a fraudulent claim," she said. "He used a real document without the owner's permission to make a claim that the owner never intended to make," Nathaniel said. "Langley is going to Helena next week to speak with Edgar directly. If Edgar confirms he has no interest in contesting, and Langley believes he won't, because Edgar sold the land in question to my predecessor, and the original sale is recorded." He paused. "The claim collapses." "James knew that," Clara said. "James knew that, and he filed anyway, hoping I wouldn't dig deep enough to find the discrepancy." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Sandra Pruitt came to this ranch 2 days after I arrived," she said. "She told me you could have any woman in the valley, and implied that families with proper standing had considered alliances with you." She looked at him. "She was here the day after Dale Creston came, and you put him off the property for what he said about me." Nathaniel was very still. "She was trying to determine if I was going to be a permanent fixture," Clara said. "Because if you married someone who was paying attention, someone who was managing the household accounts, the fraudulent claim would be harder to sustain. Someone might notice the inconsistency." He looked at her. "You think the visit was connected?" "I think it's possible that someone wanted to know how much attention the Carter Ranch was going to start paying to its own paperwork," Clara said. "I don't know that, but I think it's worth telling Langley." Nathaniel was quiet for the long moment. Then he said, "I'll write to him tonight." "Good." Clara picked her coffee back up. "And Nathaniel." "Yes. When this is resolved, when Langley comes back from Helena and Edgar Pruitt confirms what we think he's going to confirm, I want you to go to Edgar directly, not through Langley. Go to Helena yourself." "Why?" "Because an 81-year-old man is going to find out his son tried to use his name to defraud a neighbor," Clara said. "He's going to be ashamed, and a letter from a lawyer is an official response to an official situation. A visit from you is a man choosing to extend courtesy to another man's dignity." She paused. "That's the kind of thing people remember." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think about people," he said. "I think about what they need," she said. "It's the same thing." He nodded slowly. "Then, I'll go to Helena." The Pruitt situation moved through its legal mechanisms over the following weeks with the grinding patience of anything involving lawyers and territorial documents. And during those weeks, the Carter Ranch moved through its own rhythms, cattle and fencing and supply runs, and Lillian's lessons, and the 100 small daily operations that constituted the life of a working property. And Clara moved through all of it with the steady practical presence that had become, without anyone marking the precise moment of its arrival, simply part of how the ranch functioned. The hands had stopped making any adjustment for her presence weeks ago. Pete Aldous consulted her on supply questions, without apparent awareness that he was doing something he wouldn't have done 6 weeks earlier. Mrs. Beaumont, who had been running the Carter household on her own for 4 years, with the competence of a woman who understood that her authority in the house was the primary thing. Keeping the place operational had to her own evident surprise found in Clara. Not a replacement or a threat, but something she had apparently not known she was missing a partner. They worked around each other with the ease of long familiarity, which was a kind of miracle given that they had known each other less than 2 months, and which Clara attributed to the fact that competent women who respected work tended to recognize each other quickly across whatever other differences existed between them. Lillian had bloomed. There was no other word for it. The child who had been quiet and careful and taking care of everyone else's feelings, before her own had, over the course of the weeks since Clara's arrival, gradually and then rapidly become something different. Not a different child, but a fuller version of the one who had always been there, the one who had been compressing herself to fit the available space. She laughed at the table now with the unreserved abandon of a child who believed the table was a safe place to laugh. She brought Clara Things Rock's interesting sticks of feather, she considered significant, a drawing she'd made of the horse she planned to have someday, with the casual confidence of a person who expected their offerings to be received with interest. She also increasingly asked questions. "Did you always know what you wanted to be?" she asked Clara one afternoon, out of a silence that had followed a long arithmetic session. "No," Clara said. "For a long time I thought I was going to be whatever was needed." "What does that mean?" "It means I spent a lot of time being useful instead of being anything specific," Clara said. "Being useful is good, but it's different from knowing what you want." "What do you want?" Lillian asked. Clara thought about it. Genuinely thought the way she did when Lillian asked her things, because Lillian asked real questions and deserved real answers, and Clara had no interest in giving an 8-year-old the managed, softened version of the truth. "I want this," she said. "This house, your uncle, you." She paused. "I want to be somewhere that I chose. That's the most specific thing I can tell you." Lillian considered this for a moment. "I chose to be here too," she said. "I mean, I didn't have another choice when I came, but I would have chosen it anyway." She paused. "I think." "That's a very mature thing to know," Clara said. "I'm almost 9, Lillian said with the dignity of someone for whom this was a significant distinction. Clara smiled, a real smile, the kind that arrived without consultation. "Almost 9, she agreed. "Very nearly ancient." It was one evening in the 5th week of their marriage when the thing happened that Clara had been bracing for without admitting she was bracing for it. She had learned over her life that the good things, the things you had chosen and built and were beginning to trust, had a way of being tested. Not because the universe was deliberately unkind, but because nothing real was ever allowed to exist unchallenged. And the testing was in its way, how you found out whether the thing was actually what you thought it was. The test came in the form of a letter from Thomas Whitmore. Not the ashamed abbreviated communication her father had been sending since her wedding. Brief notes that said he was well, that Marcus was working, that Josephine was studying, that he thought of her. This letter was different. Clara could tell from the weight of it before she opened it, and she opened it in her room alone, because she had a feeling she wanted to read it without managing anyone else's response to her response. Her father wrote, "Clara, I have been thinking for weeks about how to say what I need to say, and I have decided the only way is to say it plainly, since you are a plain-speaking woman, and have your mother's impatience with any other kind. I am ashamed of what I did. Not the debt was a mistake, and I have made others, and I will make more. God help me, that seems to be my nature. I am ashamed that I sent you, that I put my letter in your hands and watched you ride away across that valley and told myself it was practical when what it was cowardice. You have never been something to be spent. You have never been a thing I should have been able to send. I knew that when I handed you the letter, and I sent you anyway, because I was frightened, and you were the person I trusted most not to break under the weight of it. That is not a defense. I know it is not a defense. But I want you to know that the trust was real, even if the way I acted on it was wrong. Your mother would have something very clear to say to me about this. I miss her. I hope you are well. I hope he deserves you. I don't see how he could, but I hope it. Your father. Clara sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She thought about the morning she had left, the way her father had held his coffee cup with both hands and not looked at her. She thought about the letter pressed against her ribs on the summer road. She thought about arriving at the gate of this ranch as a woman who had been sent because she was the one with nothing to lose. She thought about everything that had happened since. She was not angry. She had moved through the anger on the road and set it down before she arrived at the gate, because she'd understood somewhere in those 2 hours that carrying her father's shame, in addition to his letter, was more weight than she could manage, and also not hers to carry. But she sat with the letter, and she felt the full complicated reality of what it described: a father who had loved her imperfectly and knowingly, which was one of the harder kinds of love to receive. She was still sitting with it when Nathaniel knocked on the open door of the room. "Clara," he said. Then he saw her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said. "Come in." He came in and sat on the edge of the chair near the window, the one they had both started thinking of as his chair for the evenings when they sat in here and talked or didn't talk, which happened more and more frequently, because the talking and the not talking had become equally comfortable. She handed him the letter. He read it. His face went through several things while he read, and he didn't try to hide them, which was one of the things that had changed about him in 6 weeks. The hiding happened less. He handed the letter back. "He loves you," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "Imperfectly." "Most people do," he said. She looked at him. "Do you love imperfectly?" Howe was quiet for a moment. "I think that's the only way I know how," he said. "I think I've been doing it wrong enough times that I've gotten careful about it. Too careful." He looked at her. "I'm trying to be less careful." "I know," she said. "Does it help, the trying?" "Yes," she said. "The trying helps more than you know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said carefully, "How do you feel about your father?" She thought about it. "I love him," she said. "I think I'm going to need some time to love him without the other thing underneath it." "What's the other thing?" "The part that still flinches when I think about that morning," she said. "The part that knows he sent me because he thought I was the safest thing to risk." She paused. "I don't want to carry that. I need to feel it for a minute before I can put it down." He nodded. He didn't try to argue with it or improve it or redirect it into something more comfortable. He just nodded and stayed in the room with her, which was exactly what she needed, and exactly what 6 weeks ago she could not have predicted he would know to do. They sat in the quiet for a while. The ranch made its evening sounds around them. Somewhere down the hall, Lillian was singing something to herself off-key and entirely confident about it. After a while, Clara said, "I'm going to write back." "What will you say?" She thought about it. "That I forgive him," she said. "Not because he earned it, because I don't want to carry what I'd have to carry if I didn't." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "You're the most genuinely good person I've ever met," he said. He said it with the plainness of a man who had considered it before saying it, and had arrived at it as a fact rather than a compliment. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Don't say that." "Why not?" "Because good people are easy to dismiss," she said. "Good is what you call someone when you don't want to say anything more specific." He looked at her. "What would you want me to say instead?" She thought about it. "Strong," she said. "Say I'm strong." "You're strong," he said, without hesitation. "Clara Carter, strongest person in this house." The name landed differently than it had the first time she'd heard it applied to herself in that moment from Vera Hutchins. It had been external, applied from outside. Now it came from him, and it settled over her like something she had grown into rather than something handed to her. Clara Carter. She looked at the letter in her hands. She looked at the room they were sitting in, the room that had become their room over 6 weeks by the accumulation of small habits and chosen presences. She thought about the road. She thought about the gate. She thought about a woman who had arrived here with nothing to lose and what that had actually meant. Then she said, "I'll write the letter tonight," and stood, and Nathaniel stood with her, because that was what he did. Now moved when she moved, stayed when she stayed, showed up because he had decided to show up, and she had stopped being surprised by it and started simply receiving it, which was its own kind of learning. She went to the desk. She picked up the pen. She began, "Dear Papa, I forgive you. Not because it was nothing. Because you are my father, and I am not willing to spend what we have left being angry at you, when I could be spending it on something worth more than that. Come visit when you're ready. Clara." She sealed it. She went to sleep that night in her own house, in her own bed, next to her own husband, who was learning imperfectly and genuinely and daily how to be present with the people who needed him. She went to sleep knowing something she had not known when she rode out of her father's yard 2 months ago. She went to sleep knowing that the woman who had nothing to lose had turned out to have everything to find. And in this house, in this marriage, in this life, she had chosen with both eyes open and all the knowledge of her own worth that nobody had ever given her, and she had simply over time given to herself. She was finding it. Every single day. She was finding it. Thomas Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3 months after Clara had sent that letter. She had not known exactly when he was coming. He had written to say he intended to visit, and he had given a general window sometime before the first hard frost, and Clara had found herself in the days leading up to it, doing something she hadn't expected. She had found herself nervous. Not in the way she'd been nervous riding to this ranch the first time, which had been the clean, manageable fear of a woman heading toward a known difficulty. This was something more complicated. This was the nervousness of a person who had built something real and was about to show it to the person who had accidentally set it in motion and who needed that person to understand what they were looking at. She was in the front yard when the wagon came down the road. She knew the horse, the old gray her father had kept through every financial difficulty because he couldn't bring himself to sell her, and she stood still and watched it come, and she was aware of Nathaniel behind her on the porch, giving her the distance she needed while remaining present, which was something he had gotten quietly, consistently good at. Thomas Whitmore climbed down from the wagon with the stiffness of a man who had aged more than 3 months in 3 months. He was thinner than Clara remembered. His hat was the same one he'd always worn, and he held it in his hands when he looked at her, turning it by the brim, the way he did when he didn't know what to do with himself. He stopped a few feet away from her. He looked at her, the way people looked at something they had lost and had not expected to find again. Not unchanged, but there. Present. Real. "Clara," he said. His voice cracked on her name. Clara looked at her father, at this man who had handed her a letter, and watched her ride away, and called it practicality, and she felt all of it at once. The old wound and the scar that had formed over it, and the strange tenderness that scars sometimes produced when you finally stopped being afraid to touch them. She crossed the distance between them and put her arms around him. Haimad a sound that was not a word. His arms came around her with the grip of a man who had been rehearsing this for 3 months and still wasn't prepared for it. They stood like that for a moment. Then Clara stepped back and looked at him clearly. "You look terrible, Papa," she said. A breath of a laugh escaped him. "I've had better months." "Come inside," she said. "Mrs. Beaumont made enough food for a small army, which is normal, so don't feel obligated to comment on it." He followed her up the porch steps. Nathaniel was at the top of them, and he extended his hand before Thomas Whitmore reached the door, which was the right thing to do, and the thing Clara had known he would do without needing to ask him. "Mr. Whitmore," Nathaniel said, "glad you made the trip." Thomas Whitmore took the hand and shook it, and looked at the man his daughter had married with the complicated, searching expression of a father arriving late to a situation he should have been present for from the beginning. "Mr. Carter," he said. "Nathaniel," Nathaniel said. A pause. Something moved through Thomas Whitmore's face. "Nathaniel," he said. They went inside. Lillian was at the table, positioned with the strategic visibility of a child who had been told not to hover, but had decided that sitting at the table with a book constituted not hovering. She looked up when Thomas came in and regarded him with her characteristic serious assessment. "You're Clara's father," she said. "I am," Thomas said, looking at this child with the slight bewilderment of a man encountering something unexpected. "She has your eyes," Lillian said, "but she's nicer." Mrs. Beaumont from the kitchen. "Lillian." It's probably true, though, Lillian said, and went back to her book. Thomas Whitmore looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him without expression, which was its own kind of smile. "Sit down, Papa," she said. "I'll get you coffee." The meal that followed was one of those meals that carried more weight than any single dish could justify the weight of a family, reassembling itself around a table. Each person there, navigating their own version of the occasion's difficulty, while trying to make it look like an ordinary lunch. Thomas ate with the concentrated attention of a man who had not been eating well, and was only now in the presence of a good kitchen, and his daughter admitting it to himself. He asked Nathaniel careful, specific questions about the cattle operation, the kind of questions that revealed he'd been paying attention to what people said about the Carter Ranch, that he knew more about its workings than he'd let on. Nathaniel answered him directly and without condescension, and Clara watched the two men across the table and thought about how much the shape of a conversation could tell you about the people having it. Nathaniel was not performing acceptance. He was extending it quietly and without spectacle, the way he did most things. After lunch, Clara walked with her father out to the fence line along the north pasture. She had chosen this particular walk deliberately. It was the section of the ranch that had been at the center of the Pruitt claim, the land that would have been lost if James Pruitt's fraud had gone undetected, and it was also the section of the property where the cattle grazed most peacefully at this time of year, and she wanted her father to see it. Not as a demonstration, as a reality. Thomas walked beside her in silence for a while. The silence had a quality to it, full of things still finding their shape. Finally he said, "Are you happy?" Clara considered it with the seriousness the question deserved. "Yes," she said. Not in a simple way. In a way that has work in it, and worry in it, and uncertainty in it. She paused. "But yes. He's a good man. He's a man who is trying to be good, which is better than a man who thinks he already is." Thomas was quiet. "Clara," he said, "what I did, Papa. No, I need to say it properly." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He looked at her with the directness of a man who had spent 3 months preparing for this moment and was finally at the last possible second choosing to have it cleanly. "I sent you because I was a coward. Not because you were strong enough to handle it, though you were. Not because it was practical, though I told myself it was. I sent you because I was frightened and ashamed, and you were the person in the house I trusted most not to fall apart, and I used that trust as an excuse to do something I should not have done." Clara looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's not an apology." "I know that too. Keep going." He took a breath. "I am sorry," he said. "Not for the debt. The debt was a mistake, but mistakes happen, and I'll answer for that one for the rest of my life regardless. I'm sorry that I handed you my shame and called it responsibility. I'm sorry that I watched you ride away down that road, and I told myself it was all right because you were... He stopped. "Because I was the one with nothing to lose," Clara said. The words landed between them with their full weight. Thomas Whitmore looked at his daughter, and his face did something that Clara had not seen it do in a very long time. It stopped managing itself. It just fell open, raw and unguarded, the face of a man seeing clearly something he had been looking at wrong for 25 years. "I was wrong," he said. "About what you had to lose. About what you were." His voice was rough. "Your mother always said you were the strongest one. Not because you were the biggest, because you were the only one of us who never needed anyone to tell you who you were." Clara was very still. "She said that," she said. "Many times." He looked at her. "I thought it was a compliment. I didn't understand until you were gone that I'd been treating it like a license. Like because you didn't need to be told who you were, I didn't have to tell you who you were to me." He shook his head. That was wrong. That was very wrong. Clara looked at this man, her father, who was smaller than she remembered, and truer than she'd expected, standing at the fence line of a ranch that had become her home, in ways she couldn't have predicted on the summer road 3 months ago. She felt something release in her chest. Something she had been holding with such consistent practice that she had stopped being aware of holding it. "I forgive you, Papa," she said. "Not because it was nothing. Because you're my father, and I'm not willing to spend what we have left carrying something that belongs to both of us." He reached out and took her hand. His hand was the same hand she'd known her whole life, large and work-worn and familiar, and it shook slightly when he held hers. "She would have loved this," he said. "Your mother. She would have loved this ranch and that little girl in there, and the way you walked toward me across that yard." He paused. "Like you own the ground you stand on." "I do," Clara said simply. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was the closest Thomas Whitmore had ever come in her presence to pure joy. "Yes," he said. "You do." They walked back to the house. What neither of them knew, what Clara would not learn until later that evening, when Nathaniel told her quietly in the kitchen, while she was cleaning up after supper, was what had happened while she and her father were walking the fence line. Nathaniel had found Thomas Whitmore's ledger, not by looking for it. Thomas had left his coat on the chair in the front room when he came in, and something had fallen from the inside pocket, a folded paper worn at the creases in the way of a document handled many times. Nathaniel had picked it up, intending to set it on the table, and the paper had unfolded slightly in his hand, and he had seen without meaning to what it was. It was a repayment schedule. Thomas Whitmore had written out in his own hand a detailed schedule of payments against his debt to Nathaniel Carter. Not a gesture, not a promise. An actual schedule with actual amounts calculated against actual projected income, starting from the coming spring and running for 4 years. The amounts were small. They would take a long time. But they were real. The careful work of a man who had sat down with his own numbers and forced himself to look at them and built a structure around them, at the bottom of the page, in smaller writing. Thomas had noted, "This does not account for what I owe that can't be paid in money, that I understand, but I will pay what I can in the way I can." Nathaniel had folded it carefully and put it back where he'd found it. He told Clara about it in the kitchen, speaking quietly, while the sound of Thomas and Lillian and Marcus, who had arrived unexpectedly in the late afternoon, apparently unable to stay away. Once he knew their father was coming, drifted in from the front room. Clara stood still for a moment when he finished. "He didn't show it to me," she said. "No," Nathaniel said. "He wasn't going to." "No," Nathaniel said again. "I don't think it was for showing. I think he made it for himself, to know he had a plan." Clara turned this over in her mind. She thought about her father at a table somewhere with his ledger and his careful handwriting and his 4-year repayment schedule that he had made not to present to anyone, but to be able to look at. To know that he was in his imperfect and insufficient and genuine way trying. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "About the debt." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about that," he said, "while you were walking." He looked at her. "I was thinking that the debt was what brought you here, and that if the debt had been different, if your father had been a different kind of man, or if I had been a different kind of man, or if you had been sent anywhere else that summer, none of this would exist." He paused. "I find I have difficulty being resentful of a debt that gave me this." Clara looked at him. "You're not going to collect it," she said. "I'm going to write your father a letter," he said, telling him that the debt has been absorbed into the family, which is what happens when accounts become more complicated than money. He paused. "If you think that's the right thing." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "He'll fight it," she said. "Probably. He'll say he doesn't want charity." "It's not charity," Nathaniel said. "It's a family decision. Those are different things." Clara looked at her husband. She looked at the man who had been when she arrived a shuttered house of a person capable and cold and alone in ways he had stopped being able to see because he had lived inside them so long. She looked at the man who had gone into his niece's room and said her mother's name out loud, who had put Dale Creston off his property for speaking about her without being asked, who had taken her hand in a kitchen and held it like something he had decided was worth holding. "It's the right thing," she said. He nodded. "Nathaniel." She said his name the way she had learned to say it, with the full weight of having chosen it, of having chosen him, of knowing exactly what she'd chosen and why. "Thank you." He looked at her. "For what?" "For seeing my father the way I needed you to see him," she said. "Not as a man who failed me, as a man who's trying." Something moved through his face. The jaw relaxed, the tell she had identified weeks ago, the one that meant something had pleased him in a way he didn't know how to say. "He raised you," Nathaniel said simply. "He gets some credit for that, even if the rest of his accounting is a mess." From the front room, Lillian's voice rose with some declaration about something, followed by Marcus's voice, disputing it, followed by Thomas Whitmore's laugh, his real laugh, the one Clara hadn't heard in 3 years, rusty with disuse and completely genuine. Clara and Nathaniel stood in the kitchen and listened to it. The evening that followed was the kind of evening that certain houses produced and others never managed, not because of what was in them, but because of who was in them, and whether the people present had chosen to be there or had simply arrived. The front room filled with the Whitmore family in their incomplete, imperfect, reconstituting form. Thomas in the chair by the window. Marcus sprawled with his particular young man's studied casualness. Lillian positioned between them with the proprietary confidence of someone who had decided this was her family occasion and she was a legitimate participant in it. Mrs. Beaumont brought coffee and stayed because nobody suggested she shouldn't, and she had over the months moved from employee to something the house wouldn't function correctly without, which was its own form of belonging. Nathaniel sat at the edge of it. Not outside it, at the edge in the specific way of a man who was learning that the edge and the center were not as different as he had spent 4 years believing. Clara sat in the middle of it. She watched her father tell a story, one of the old ones from before the debt and the mistakes from the time when he had driven freight routes and known every road in the territory, and had briefly been the man he'd always meant to be. She watched Marcus listen without the armor he usually wore around his father, the arm of young grievance he'd carried so consistently it had become posture. She watched Lillian insert herself into the story at exactly the moment she found something interesting, asking Thomas a question that derailed the narrative entirely and sent it somewhere more interesting than it had been going. She watched Nathaniel watch all of it, and she watched his face do the thing it had been doing more and more, opening the way things opened when they had been closed long enough and had finally found a reason not to be. She thought about the road. She thought about the letter pressed against her ribs. She thought about arriving at the gate of this ranch as a woman who had been sent because she had nothing to lose. She thought about all the things that phrase had meant and all the ways she had turned out to be wrong about it. She had not had nothing to lose. She had had everything to find, and she had not yet found it, which was different from having nothing. Late in the evening, after Thomas and Marcus had been settled in the guest rooms, and Lillian had been put to bed with far less resistance than usual, she had reached up and hugged Clara before sleeping with the fierce, unselfconscious grip of a child who had decided something permanently. Clara stood on the front porch with Nathaniel in the cool October dark. The stars were the same stars that had been there on her first night. The Montana sky was the same enormous sky, but everything else was different, and she stood in the difference and felt it fully, without flinching from it, without the old habit of making herself smaller so the feeling wouldn't be too much. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said. "About what?" Howe was quiet for a moment. He turned to look at her, the full, direct look that she knew now was his most honest mode, the one he used when he had decided to say something that mattered and was not going to qualify it into safety. "About what I said when I proposed," he said. "Out by the fence." "I remember it clearly," she said. "I said I needed someone beside me," he said. "I said the house needed someone. I said Lillian needed someone." He paused. "I've been thinking about how much of what I said was about need." Clara looked at him. And I want to tell you something that isn't about need," he said, "because I think you've heard enough in your life about what you could provide, and not enough about something else." He looked at her steadily. "I want you here. Not because this ranch needs managing. Not because Lillian needs a woman in the house. Not because my accounts are better when you're looking at them, which they are." He paused. "Because when you're in a room, I think more clearly. I feel less alone than I have in 4 years. Because you challenge me when I need it, and leave me alone when I need that too, and I have never once had to explain to you the difference." He paused again. The jaw was not relaxed. This was costing him something, which meant it was real. "Because somewhere in the last 3 months, without any particular announcement, you became the person I think of when I'm trying to decide who I want to be." Clara was very still. The night moved around them. Somewhere in the pasture, cattle shifted. The house behind them held its warmth against the October air, holding the people inside it the way a good house did not trapping containing. Making space for people to be what they were. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "That is the most words I have ever heard you say in a row." A sound escaped him, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, the kind she had been collecting since the first time she'd produced one, because they were rare, and they were genuine, and they were his. "You told me to say what I meant," he said. "I did," she said. "I stand by it." He looked at her. The laugh had settled, but the openness remained the open face. The face she had spent 3 months watching emerged from behind the controlled stillness he'd worn so long it had started to look like his real expression. "I love you," he said. 3 words. Said in the same quiet, direct way he said everything when he meant it completely. No performance. No qualification. Just the fact of it, offered plainly the way he had offered her coffee in the morning and taken her hand in the kitchen and written a letter to cancel a debt because it had become a family matter. Clara felt it land in her chest and spread outward. Not like a shock, not like something she hadn't expected, but like something she had been making space for quietly and carefully for 3 months, and it had arrived exactly where she'd made room for it. "I know," she said. "Then, I love you too." I didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. A small gesture, the most personal thing he had ever done. The kind of gesture that belonged to people who had decided each other irrevocably. And then he left his hand along her jaw for a moment, and she held still in it, and the October night held still around both of them. Then she said, "Come inside, it's cold." "In a minute," he said. "Nathaniel." "Just a minute," he said. "I want to stand here another minute." She understood. She stood beside him for another minute in the dark, and the cold, and the enormous Montana sky, in the life they had built together from a debt and a letter, and 2 people who had been broken in different enough ways that they had fit together in the gaps. Then they went inside. Thomas Whitmore left 2 days later, with the carefully folded letter from Nathaniel in his coat pocket, the one about the debt being absorbed into the family, and the equally carefully folded knowledge that he had done one thing right, even if he had done it for the wrong reasons. He had sent Clara down that road, and Clara had walked it all the way to the end and found what was waiting there. He drove away in his borrowed wagon on a clear October morning, and Clara watched him go from the porch, and she did not feel the leaving, the way she once would have felt it, as a diminishment, as a confirmation of the aloneness she had always half believed was her permanent condition. She felt it as what it was, a man going home to the life he was rebuilding, carrying the evidence that his daughter was all right. More than all right. Lillian came and stood beside her on the porch. "Is he coming back?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. "At Christmas, if the roads hold." Lillian nodded with satisfaction. "Good. I need to beat him at checkers. I let him win last night." "You let him win." "He looked like he needed it," Lillian said simply, and went back inside. Clara stood on the porch alone for a moment. She thought about Lillian at 8 years old, reading a man's face, and making a calculation about what he needed, and quietly providing it. She thought about how that same quality, the noticing, the providing, had nearly been pressed out of her by a world that kept telling her the noticing didn't matter, because the noticer didn't matter. She thought about what it meant that Lillian was growing up in a house where that quality was recognized. Where she was recognized. Where Clara herself was recognized. Not for her usefulness. Not for her practicality. Not for being the one with nothing to lose. For being exactly who she was. Winter came to Montana with the blunt honesty that characterized everything about that territory. No gradual adjustment. No polite transition. Just the one morning when the ground was different, and the air was different, and the season had simply without consultation arrived. Clara met it the same way she met everything, directly, with preparation and without complaint. The ranch moved into its winter rhythms. The cattle were moved to the sheltered pastures. The supply stores were checked and supplemented. The household settled into its indoor season, which was longer and closer than the outdoor one, and which Clara found to her own mild surprise that she preferred. She had always been a woman of interiors, of kitchens and close spaces, and the particular warmth of rooms where people were gathered, and the winter made the ranch's interior life the primary one, which meant she was in a quiet and unceremonious way in her element. The Pruitt claim resolved itself in December as Robert Langley had predicted. Edgar Pruitt confirmed from Helena that he had never authorized any claim on the Carter land, and that the copy of his deed had been taken from his home without his knowledge. James Pruitt, faced with the evidence, withdrew the claim before it could become a legal matter with more serious consequences, and there was a month of valley talk about it that Clara let wash over her without engaging, because she had learned that the valley's conversation about itself was like weather, real, sometimes severe, always temporary. Nathaniel went to Helena in November, before the worst of the winter travel, and visited Edgar Pruitt as Clara had suggested. He was gone 4 days. He came back quieter than he'd left, in the way of a man who had encountered something that had given him things to think about. He told her that Edgar Pruitt was a small, precise man who lived alone with his books and his memories, and who had wept briefly when Nathaniel told him that the matter was resolved and no legal action would be taken against his son, and that Nathaniel had sat with him for an hour after that, and they had talked improbably about cattle, because it was what both of them knew and what the moment needed. He said something, Nathaniel told her that evening. He said that the worst thing about getting old was watching the people you'd raised make choices you hadn't taught them to make. He paused. He meant James. But I thought about your father. Clara looked at him. And what did you conclude? She said. That it goes both ways, he said. That people also watch the people they raised make choices they didn't dare to hope for. He looked at her. Your father watched you ride into a stranger's property and build a life. I don't think he expected that. No, Clara said. He didn't. Do you think he expected it from you before? Clara thought about it honestly. No, she said. He expected me to manage. He didn't expect me to thrive. There's a difference, Nathaniel said. Yes, she said. There is. He looked at her for a moment. You knew you were going to thrive, he said. Didn't you? Even on that road. Some part of you knew. Clara considered this. Really considered it the way she would have considered a problem in the accounts, turning it over and looking at it from each angle. Some part of me refused not to, she said finally. That's not quite the same thing, but it might be close enough. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something had settled somewhere in him. On the last day of December, as the year closed itself down, and the Montana winter pressed its full weight against the walls of the ranch house, Clara sat at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet. Her favorite time, the hour before the household woke, the hour that had always been hers, and she held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the window where the dark was just beginning to shift toward gray. She thought about the woman who had pressed a letter against her ribs and ridden into uncertainty because she was the one they could afford to risk. She thought about everything that had followed. The gate, the kitchen, the man who had asked if she'd come all that way to apologize for a debt she'd never made, the child who didn't like the quiet, the roses on the fence that had been fighting for years without anyone watching, the letter she'd written to her father and her father's handwritten repayment schedule that hadn't been for anyone's eyes but his own. The morning on the porch when Nathaniel had said "I love you" in the particular way he said things that were true, plainly, directly, without decoration, as though the truth didn't need any help being what it was. Lillian's laugh from down the hall. The sound of Nathaniel moving in the room above her, the early riser's sounds of a man beginning his day. Her home, her people, her life. She had ridden into this valley with nothing but her own unshakable knowledge of who she was in a world that had spent 25 years trying to convince her that who she was would never be enough. She had not argued with that world. She had not performed a different version of herself to satisfy it. She had simply continued to be exactly what she was, with complete and quiet conviction, until the world, this small piece of it, this ranch, this man, this child, this valley had reorganized itself around her. That was the thing nobody had told her. That was the thing you couldn't learn from the outside and could only learn from the living of it. She hadn't needed the world to change its mind about her. She had needed to stop waiting for it to. Nathaniel came into the kitchen. He looked at her, his wife, at the table in the early morning with her coffee and her thoughts exactly where she always was. At this hour, the still center of the house, before the house began its day. And he did not say good morning, and she did not say it either, because they had moved past the formality of announcing the obvious. He poured his coffee. He sat across from her. They were quiet together in the kitchen, in the good and chosen quiet of two people who had found in each other a place where silence was not emptiness, but fullness. The fullness of a life that was exactly what it should be. Outside, the first light of the new year was beginning to show itself on the Montana horizon. Clara Whitmore. Carter. The woman they had sent because she had nothing to lose. The woman who had walked into a stranger's house and made it into a home. The woman who had been invisible until she chose quietly and without apology to be seen, set down her coffee cup and looked at her husband and felt in the full and settled center of her chest the absolute certainty of a woman who had found every single thing she had ever been worth. She had not been a burden. She had never been a burden. She had been from the very beginning the answer, and all it had taken was one summer road and the unshakable knowledge of her own worth to prove